開けるんだ開くのさその不思議な扉を登れるんだ登るのさ未来に触れるその心炸裂の富の節消えてゆく皆の命愛してる女性に裏切られ白涙が宇宙にさまよその行方さえも知らぬただただ自由に漂う登れるんだ登るのさ未来に触れるその心今私の扉さ熱く燃える扉さ正義の証扉さ敵を落とせ扉さ我らの扉さ
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by Sean Chapman.
And Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to peer into the delightfully deranged mind of Tomino Yoshiyuki with our Tomino-THON. This week on the show, we are finishing up our two-part episodes for Combat Mecha Xabungle. On last week's episode, we covered the first half of the show, episodes 1 to 26. On this week's episode, we are finishing the show with episodes 27 to 50, and also we'll be discussing the rather strange compilation movie Xabungle Grafitti they made after the show. And, you know, when we decided originally to split our coverage of Xabungle into two halves, we didn't realize just how distinctive the two halves were. We just said, like, hey, 50 episodes, that's a lot to cover, but we had never seen it. And I think it's pretty fascinating, actually, when you look at Xabungle, just how different the second half is. And I think is more uneven, but also has a lot of very interesting things to it, including something I'm very excited to talk about today, which is a seminal moment for our Tomino-THON, where we get our introduction to one of Tomino's most enduring character archetypes with what he does with Elchi Cargo in the second half of the show.
Yes, absolutely. I was fascinated, Sean, because I thought last week I kind of patted myself on the back going, hey, episode 26 was, I found a really good, I was right. That was the right spot to end it, made for a good discussion, because that was sort of, we made that call together, but I think we were debating 25, 26, and I said, I think 26 is more the right one. And it's correct because the 27 to 50 stretch, these last 24 episodes feel way more like a season 2 than the second half of the show. Like, this feels like if you go to the 2010s and you have Gundam 00 or Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans, the way those do their season 1, season 2, where it is one big 50-episode show, but there's a pretty hard break in the story, and that's basically exactly how Xabungle works. Like, there's, you know, they don't, I was going to say they don't change the theme song, but they do. We have a new animation for it that's, like, really, really cool, even if the song is the same, and lots of other stuff changes. We go to a winter tundra environment. We have a pretty heavy shift in how the show handles some of its like villains and stuff. And then, as you say, the main demarcation point is what they do with Elchi Cargo, which is both the most interesting thing in this batch of episodes and the most problematic. But it is definitely the most fascinating going forward in the career of Tomino, as you were saying.
Yeah, it's definitely, and I was just very kind of surprised by the direction the show went, because it wasn't really what I was anticipating. And I think it's just very interesting where I think it's clear that Tomino himself was kind of struggling with, I don't think he ever figured out what Combat Mecha Xabungle really was in some ways, but in some ways this is what makes it really fascinating. And it is, as we talked about last time, it is just such a show that is a lodestone for the whole 80s decade of mecha anime. Like, there's just so much that is pulled from this in terms of how it handles we have a new mech, the Walker Gallia, in terms of how it does some of those character arcs. Like, Elchi is obviously very influential to Tomino, but also something that spreads out to other mecha shows of this time period. And so it is, Combat Mecha Xabungle continues to be this show that is very kind of unassuming on its surface, but its roots in terms of how it influenced the genre just run incredibly deep.
Yeah. I do think, like, as you said, this half is uneven. This is the only Tomino show I've ever seen where I would say the ending is underwhelming. Like
Yes,
it's
I
the
agree.
only show that even his like weaker shows, like a Daitarn or a why am I
Zambot.
forgetting Zambot, end on their, like, with their best foot forward. Daitarn especially, its best episode is its final episode. I would say Xabungle's worst stretch is its final couple episodes, and like that's notable put against his other shows, which usually, even if they have issues along the way, rally towards like an absolute knockout conclusion.
Yeah, I definitely agree that it's sort of one of the things that's very surprising about it is that even with something like Triton of the Sea, which I don't think has a good climax, has like a climax that it felt like Tomino was like really passionate about.
Yeah.
And Xabungle ends at a point where it feels almost kind of like ambivalent about itself, about like, and I think the show never really settles on what it wants to be tonally. I don't know if it ever really settles on exactly what it wants to say from a bigger picture perspective about like Jiron and his friends amidst this bigger setting in the revolution and that kind of stuff. It is just this thing where it feels like Tomino never quite resolved exactly what he wanted Xabungle to be. And I think it's interesting that in the second half of the show, I think you more clearly feel than in the first half the nature of this show being a thing that Tomino was jumped into doing basically by sunrise, and he came up with the entire idea of it at midnight in a hotel room. We covered all of that in last week's history segment, and I think the first half of the show feels very kind of electric, and I don't think you would like anticipate that was the kind of origins of it. But I think in the second half, you more feel the sense of the story was not as planned out. It was not as kind of like thorough, given as much time to cook as some of Tomino's other shows, like Gundam onwards. And I think you kind of like feel the cost of that in the second half of the show.
You definitely do, although I also want to give, like, these episodes credit. I breezed the fuck through these. They took me just a couple of days to watch because they're very fun. It's extremely well structured, even if I think there are narrative issues. Like, I split the episodes we watched today into little sort of arcs, the same way I did with the last episode we did for the first half of the show. And it's actually really interesting to me that you can split these 24 episodes into exact 5-episode and, in one case, 4-episode chunks. And in every case, what you have is at the end of, like, basically every 5 episodes, there's a big status quo shift that happens at the end of that batch. And so there is this sense of forward momentum, but it is also fighting a lack of forward momentum elsewhere. It's a really fascinating batch of episodes because it is structured the way Tomino is pretty good at structuring, like, these shows that are both episodic in form but also very heavily serialized, where we keep things moving along and we kind of explore a new status quo for a couple of episodes before upending it, and that feels like the show feels really good, really solid to watch because of that. But then you also start to realize that even as we're having some big status quo shifts, usually around like Arthur rank and some of the elements within the Innocent, there are zero status quo shifts happening with, like, the overall Elchi situation, or, oh, nobody is dying, and not only is nobody dying, but no villains are being taken off the board. We're going into the finale with nothing. Like, there's this interesting push and pull between evolving things and not evolving things that is also a very new sensation to see in a Tomino series.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. That it is, it's not a bad show. It never ends up being a bad show. It's like very entertaining. It's very watchable, and there are lots of really interesting ideas. And as you say, there's lots of like good plot momentum and stuff. But it's weird because it's all on the fringes of the show. It's all like, oh, the situation with Salt, the revolutionary force, is changing. The situation with the Innocent is evolving, but the core dynamic of the main characters is like locked in place. Basically, as soon as Elchi becomes brainwashed, there's no forward movement on that, and that locks in Rag and it locks in Jiron, and they're in the position they are in until the very, very ending of the show. And there is this like weird sort of feeling, I'm with you, that I had watching the show, which is like lots of stuff is changing. Like there is a lot of forward plot momentum in all these different ways, and yet you don't feel it because in the core place where it most matters, it's not happening. And it is just a very different dynamic of a show. And I think it is where you feel that sense of Tomino trying to balance this weird like other kind of more comedic tone and genre he wants to infuse into Xabungle, but not knowing exactly how to do that and how that meshes with the dramatic storytelling chops he really, you know, developed with Gundam and Ideon. And there is just, yeah, like a very strange sensation to watching the second half of the show.
There definitely is. And it's also strange because the first half, the like season 1, does have a lot of evolution. You do have villains get dispatched. You do have like Jiron, Rag, and to a lesser extent, but still a real extent, Elchi, are all very different characters in episode 26 than they are in episode 1. And like that evolution is really cool to see. And I think Jiron and Rag still continue elements of their evolution in the second half of this show, but they also regress and become plastic, or not plastic, but like non-plastic, I guess. They become static that's the word I'm looking for, in ways that become a little problematic. So like, it's a really interesting show to talk about. It's a show that if you like Tomino, you should absolutely still watch. Like, I think you and I are both on board. Like, Xabungle's a ton of fun, you know, if for no other reason than to get that fucking theme song like stuck in your head for months on end, which is just a joy. But, you know, it's a really interesting show.
Yes, and again, it is one where it's just like if you've seen lots of other 80s mecha stuff in Tomino's other shows, there is a sense of real discovery to this of like, oh, that's where this comes from. Like,
yes.
There is something very exciting about seeing that, like, okay, here's all these ideas, some big, some small, that Xabungle is like kind of the proving ground for a lot of them. And there's just like a real sense of discovery to the show in that dimension that's pretty fascinating from like a historical perspective.
Oh, we've said this before, but it's continues to be true. Like, if you, like us, formerly came from Gundam to Zeta Gundam, not seeing everything in between, and Zeta Gundam feels like such a huge, like, leap. Like, and you would just, and I think at the time we watched that and go, oh, well, it was, 6-7 years later, blah, blah, blah. But, like, now we start filling in those gaps. If you see Ideon and you go, oh, well, there's a lot of that happened here. And I think Xabungle, a lot of that happened here, too. And it also makes me excited to see the next two shows as well. But, like, okay, it didn't come out of nowhere. And, of course, I don't think we assumed that to begin with. But you start seeing those pieces move into place. And even a show that is as tonally different as Xabungle has a lot of influence on Zeta Gundam later on.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Yeah, like you just see so many echoes of stuff that Zeta Gundam is going to just do much better. And then also Double Zeta. We made that comparison last time as well, just in terms of like the wanting to have some more of the comedic stuff. And in fact, that's one of the things that's interesting about Double Zeta is that it feels, I think you can see how much Tomino and his collaborators learned from Xabungle, because I think Double Zeta is kind of like what Xabungle... It's like Xabungle, but done much better in terms of the overall scope of the show, where it starts very comedic and it has the kind of like frantic tone in that kind of stuff, but then it evolves into a more dramatic mode, which I think feels more natural. And it's one of the weird things about Xabungle is that really the first half of the show is the one that feels much more like dramatic and like centered on heavier drama, that has the big character deaths. It has episodes where people die. It's like focused more on that stuff. And it feels weird that the evolution of the show ultimately becomes more comedic. And I don't think I ever would have expected, based on the first half of the show, just how much kind of like slapstick comedy stuff there is in the final episode, even when there is a couple of big Tomino things that happen in the final episode where there is technically a big character death. You have Elchi becomes blinded, a la, Kateshina-san from Victory Gundam later. But it's so weird because it is juxtaposed with all this slapstick comedy that just doesn't fit. And like Double Zeta, I think, is a show that shows that evolution in a way that felt much more natural.
I think the other thing that Double Zeta gets to improve on is, like, Judo and his crew are so clearly an evolution of Jiron and the Sand Rats.
Yes.
And I love Jiron and the Sand Rats all the way through to the end. I love those characters. I love Dyke and Bloom and Chill especially. And I think Bloom becomes like the star of the second half of this show, because he's the one who gets a really nice arc that's like very meaty in here. And I think you really see echoes of that crew when you get to Double Zeta. And I think they're able to do a a better story around them that really brings it home. But this obviously every Tomino show is about some kind of like family dynamic on the board of a big ship, right? Like, or on the crew of a ship. But the thing that Xabungle does differently is it's a much looser assembly of people who are essentially friends who don't need to be there, who actively start deciding to be there and become this kind of found family. And Double Zeta is the Gundam that is closest to that because it's the one furthest afield from like a military scenario for these characters because, Bright has nothing and nobody at the start of that show. Yeah. And so he's like, hey, you thieves, you'll want to hang out on my ship, and that's kind of how it goes. And I think it's a good evolution of what we see here in Xabungle.
Yes, but it is just one of the pleasures of watching Combat Mecha Xabungle as a Tomino fan is it is full of those moments you're like, okay, this is where he learned this lesson. And stuff like that is very cool to watch. Kind of, it's like it's a little bit similar to Zambot 3 in that way, of where it's one of the most fun things about watching Zambot is like this is kind of where he started playing with this idea. This is where he started developing that, even if it doesn't all work, because he's trying something new. And Xabungle is trying, not just for Tomino, but also just like generally for this kind of anime, so much new stuff that it makes sense that not all of it is like perfect at kind of his first attempt here.
Absolutely. So where do you want to kick off with our in-depth discussion? We did all of the history and backstory last time, so we could go through some major topics. We could kind of break down the plot of these episodes. Where do you want to start, Sean?
I think the part I'm just kind of like chomping at the bit to talk about is I want to talk about the Elchi stuff.
Yeah, me too.
That is the thing that watching it, I was like, oh my God, this is where it all happens. This is where it comes from. Because, if you're someone who's a big fan of Gundam, you know that Tomino gets like this obsession with this certain type of like female character archetype that he like keeps on redoing a bunch of times. And it's like you can kind of track a lot of his development and evolution as an artist by how is this kind of female character used up through Turn A Gundam in particular, where you have like this like grand evolution of it, I would say, with Kiel and Diana in that show. But there's just this like moment of realization in the show for a Gundam fan, like, oh my God, this is where the cyber new type lady comes from. It's really here. And it's amazing. I mean, it's not amazing in the show, but it's just amazing as a Tomino fan to be like, oh my God, it wasn't Zeta Gundam. Zeta Gundam wasn't the thing, which is what I always just kind of assumed, because Zeta Gundam has like 4 or 5 characters that do this plot archetype, because it's kind of like what that show is about in some ways. And it was just like, oh my God, it wasn't Zeta. It was here all along.
And even, Sean, having watched the first 26 episodes of Xabungle, would you have predicted that in any way coming out of the first half of the show? That this is where we were going?
I think that's one of the things that's like incredible about it is like you just don't see it coming at all. And it's just the way that it's so fully formed as the cyber new type style female character archetype, which is this like character who is an ally or like an erstwhile ally who is also usually an object of like kind of romantic or familial affection for the main character, then is brainwashed either like very literally in this case or like with 4, or is more vaguely kind of psychically manipulated or psychologically manipulated a la Requiem Londe from Zeta Gundam, and they become an enemy that the main character either has to kill or find some way to bring them back onto their side, or both. And it is just a thing that Tomino becomes super fixated on this character archetype, and it appears very distinctively in so many different things he did, that it then also becomes a thing that a lot of other mecha shows start doing. Obviously other Gundam shows take it, as they do with a lot of the kind of character tropes, and other Gundam shows do it as well. But it is just a like you can't look at Tomino's body of work without really seriously like examining this character archetype and what it means and how it evolves.
And it's interesting in, as you say, Sean, how fully formed it arrives here, because the inciting incident of this batch of episodes is Elchi's kidnapping. Yes. And it is Elchi's kidnapping and then throwing her into this brainwashing scenario. And she comes out of that. I mean, it's the biggest thing is just the look of it. The like 80s like fitness, like I don't know what you would call it. Like she's in this leotard with this like bandana and the crazy hair. She looks like she's gonna go record a fitness video with Richard Simmons, basically.
Yes.
She's either gonna do that or go kill all of her friends. Like that is what Elchi Cargo looks like in these episodes. You have the actress who you've got to shout out here because she is phenomenal in this batch of episodes, Yoko Mari, who, like, her Elchi voice is such an exaggerated character voice in the first half of the show, and it's really fun and funny to listen to. But the way she modulates that through these episodes into the, like, hardened battle commander version of Elchi, and then back out to original Elchi at the end, is a very, very impressive performance. But you get all of that. You get her, the look is exactly right. The overall kind of conflict that Giron has with her and with the rest of the crew over what has happened is there. The one thing that I think kind of breaks the archetype here that he will correct for in future versions of this is that Elchi, it is all done non-consensually to her. She is kidnapped and she is brainwashed, and there is no element of her choosing or going off of existing choices to go do this. The betrayal is completely out of her hands, and it makes her a weirdly, like, both the most active character of these episodes, and that she's the one who changes and grows the most, but also completely passive. She is also kind of a hot potato being passed around, which also kind of flattens, I think, the moral dynamic of what the crew of the Iron Gear is debating about with her, because she is so completely a victim in this story, versus, like, I think the two most obvious ones that you can compare her to is Reko Alande in Zeta and Katajina Luce in Victory, particularly Katajina given where this show ends. But both of those are characters who are, while there is an element of manipulation, also make very active decisions that drive those shows forward. And so that's where it is this fascinating thing of it. It is so the Cyber New type story, but it is also missing, I think, components that make that story so compelling in future incarnations.
Yeah, and I guess here, so in the notes, I kind of tried to break out, and I wanted to kind of go through this, of the progression of the things we know from Gundam, and we can kind of re-hit these when we get to those shows, because I do think there's, like, he's so fixated on this kind of storyline of this female character that is brainwashed or manipulated and becomes some sort of enemy, but there's, like, a kind of, like, a spectrum of them. Again, Zeta Gundam is particularly instructive for this because there's so many of them. But kind of when I was breaking this out, and I had the starting point, arguably, is Lala from original Mobile Suit Gundam, who is not exactly this type of character, but is clearly the, like, precursor for it. But Lala Soon is never on Amuro's side, so I don't think it's like she doesn't fully fit in, but it's like this sort of, and we talked about with our Gundam episode that in many ways, like, his kind of idea for the show and the ending for Gundam revolving around this line he had for some character about the, like, I wanted to have your child. I believe now that could be true, or I can't remember exactly how it was translated, but that sense of this, like, this sort of missed fate between these two people who ended up on opposite sides has the kind of vibe of the Cyber New type stuff, and obviously some of the aesthetic of it all comes from Lala Soon, but she's different enough that I don't think it's exactly this type of character.
I totally agree. And I would also wonder, like, do you think Korosu in Daitarn is also a precursor to this? Because I know it's also different in that obviously she's never on Haran Banjo's side. That show is obviously very different in structure. But the way the Haran Korosu, like, dynamic that you get at the midpoint of Daitarn and in the finale is so reminiscent to me of, like, Camille and Rekoa in Zeta that, like, I also feel like you would put her in the bucket as well.
Sure, yes, I think that's fair enough, that, like, Korosu, it's further away than Lala Soon is, but there's still this, like, there's something stuck in Tomino's craw about women and this, and it's like, wherever it is, like, it starts fermenting there, it becomes a much bigger thing in Lala Soon. I would also say a kind of primordial version of this you can see around the edges is Cheryl Formosa in Ideon, who had a couple points in the show almost, like, kind of turns. You know, there's the part where she tries to run away. There's all the stuff at the end of Ideon, either the TV show or the movie, or the beginning of the movie, I guess, for Be Invoked, where she is almost sort of antagonistic, or she's just sort of, like, laughing at the, the futility of it all.
Yes.
That, again, it's not really this character trope, but you can just you can smell it on Cheryl, that there's this sort of distinctive vibe to it that I think you kind of see forming there. But then it just sort of like drops in a like very fully formed version in Elchi. But again, I think we could talk about this more, that he does not really know what to do with it beyond the idea. It's the fully formed idea of this is what this character archetype is, but I don't think he knows how to actually explore it in terms of the plot. That's kind of part of the problem with Xabungle. We don't know about Dunbine. I don't know about Dunbine, if this character archetype is in Dunbine or not. I can tell you with a lot of certainty from playing Super Robot Wars Y that Heavy Metal Elgheim has at least one character that is this, if not maybe a bunch. And I think Elgheim is going to be a big show to talk about with this trope. I think just plant that flag right now. I think we'll be talking about this a lot with Elgheim. And then Zeta Gundam is where he goes crazy with it. If maybe he didn't already go crazy with Elgheim, we'll see there. But Zeta Gundam, you've got 4. Obviously is the, in terms of the world of Gundam, 4 is the character I think you think of with this trope, because she is the one with all the Psycho Gundam aesthetic, the sort of erstwhile love interest dynamic, with 4, that kind of tragic, almost Romeo and Juliet kind of element to it is something that gets taken up. And if there's anyone that influenced not just Tomino, but the mecha world in general, it's definitely 4 Murasame. And Zeta Gundam and other Gundam shows just love that kind of 4 specific plotline. But let's not forget that Zeta Gundam also has Rosemi, or Rosemi Abaddon, maybe one of the least effective elements of Zeta Gundam, but you have another cyber new type. This one is less of a love interest for Camille, but more of this kind of weird, younger sister. She kind of becomes infantilized when her kind of programming or whatever kind of malfunctions. You then have Rekoa, who is, I think, much closer to Elchi, where she is someone who is not brainwashed, but psychically manipulated by Papin Shiroko. But she is the character who's full-on been an ally for the whole show, and then near the end becomes someone that Camille has to fight. And then also I would kind of put Sarah from Zeta Gundam in this bucket. She's not as full because she is an enemy the entire time, but all of Katz's stuff in Zeta Gundam of trying to get Sarah to come over is it's what if it is this type of character, but they just really are not into you at all, kid, and you should just let it go, is kind of what Sarah is in Zeta Gundam.
I'm just going to plant a flag right now. I know we've said we're not going to be rewatching all of the Gundam shows, but if we can actually resist the urge to just rewatch all of Zeta Gundam by the time we get there, I'm going to be very surprised given how much we're already talking about it. Just planting that flag for the future, as everyone can place their bets on whether we will have the strength to actually not do that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that I did re-download all of Zeta Gundam after playing Super Robot Wars Alpha. Because unfortunately you can't watch the American releases of it because they don't have the fucking theme songs on there, and I know
you got to import the Japanese Blu-rays, and you got to have some money to do that. So
yes. Anyway,
no, I have it on my hard drive right here. So Sean, we will revisit this conversation off the air.
Yes. But that's where, and then again, Zeta Gundam is all about this. I mean, Zeta Gundam ends with Camille fucking communing with the spirits of all the dead women from across the whole show and using them to pierce Shiroko, the great manipulator and misogynist, through the chest. And it's amazing. Then
to penetrate him, you might say, in a Freudian reading of the scene.
Yes. Then Double Zeta pulls back on it a little bit, but does have, of course, Pudu and Pudu 2, or Pla, if you want to go with the terrible official romanization of that character's name, who obviously is just full on this character archetype. Then also Karasun, who is not as central, but is also very much this type of character as well. You then have in Char's counterattack. He even finds a way to fit it into it's a movie, and he still is I'm still going to do this character, that's obviously what Quest is fully in Char's counterattack, is that entire character arc just done with a single character in one movie. Gundam F91, it's not as full, but I would definitely say Cecily / Bellarona is still in this pool. She never becomes a foe, but she is, the love interest of the main character who is taken by the enemies, is on the enemy side, at least in terms of a physical sense, for almost the entire story. So I would still say he's still in this kind of pool of character types in Gundam F91 with Cecily.
Yes. And then Victory Gundam is like the climax of this, right?
Yes.
Like this is like the ultimate articulation, and then from here on out, it's different versions of it if they're there at all.
Yes, Katejina-san in Victory Gundam is the, like, we'll talk about this when we get to our full Victory Gundam episode, but I do think it is like, whatever it is, and we'll talk about whatever it is and kind of explore it as we go through these shows with their Tomino-thon, but there's something about this idea that just is stuck in his brain. And I think Katejina is him working through it kind of fully by making the most monstrous, the most extreme version of it. She is the full-on main antagonist of that show by the end of it. It's like, it's kind of, it is the closest to what the Elchi Cargo thing is if Elchi never pulled out of it. If Elchi just went deeper and deeper until by the end, she was basically manipulating Kashim and the other innocent, and she was the one really in charge. That's what Katejina is in Victory Gundam. And of course has the same ending as Elchi, just in a much more dramatic sense, and in a much more dramatically appropriate sense. It feels weird that Elchi's punished, but Katejina ends that show blind, just like Elchi does for Combat Mecha Xabungle.
I mean, it's like a Victory Gundam is another show I feel like just for me, I need to rewatch because that show is so clearly Tomino working through so many of these things.
Yes.
And I feel like that show is going to be very different to me when we get to it having done all of this stuff, if that makes sense. And I think Katejina is just so clearly in conversation with Elchi where like the ending, the last scene of Xabungle is Jiron going after Elchi and like saying, it's okay, we're here for you, you have a family, you can't do this on your own, which is also kind of the message of Xabungle as a show, and it is a very nice ending. I think the writing in that last scene is lovely. And Katejina's ending is the mirror of that. It is the, you burned so many bridges that not only can you not do this on your own, but there's no option. No one is going to come for you. You're done. And like, there is a really interesting conversation at work there. Like, because that last scene of Victory Gundam, I know it's there for you, Sean, and for me, it's just burned into the mind. It is so disturbing and sad and bleak, but in a way that feels earned. And I do think is like an answer to the questions Xabungle raises in weird ways.
Absolutely. And just to quickly run through the other pieces. So Brain Powered, I believe, it's been 5 or 6 years since I watched it, so my specific memories of it are a little bit vague, but I'm pretty sure there was a character that fits in this archetype. But I don't want to say very definitively without rewatching it. Turn A Gundam, when we get background to Turn A Gundam, I think there's a good discussion to be had about Kielheim / Diana Sorrel, and we kind of talked about it in the original Turn A Gundam episode as well, where that kind of weird dual character, very Shakespearean kind of thing he does there, feels like it is this kind of, after Katejina-san flushed it out of his system and he had a good long think, he's like, this is this kind of like evolved version of it. And obviously it's like one of the best things in his whole career is what he does with those characters. Overman King Gainer, from what I remember, has a character that kind of like Turn A Gundam is a like alternate take on this, that it's like a very different version of it. And then as far as I can recall, there's really nobody in Rekkengisen G that is really like this. I mean, you can make your arguments for like the girls that are with Mask. There's like Baraya Peor, I think your character is, the pink-haired girl. One of the pink-haired girls. There's a couple that maybe have a little bit of the vibe to them, but none of like the plot to them. So I don't think like they really fit with this archetype. I don't know if you agree with that or not, Jonathan.
I think I would agree. I think Rekkengisten G is such a different show overall. Like, it's much more in the Ideon space of what it's doing narratively and ideationally and all that, too. So, like, it's, even though it is a Gundam show, it's the most, like, as we've said before, his non-Gundam works. So it kind of moves out of this space.
Yes. But I hope what was made apparent by us running through that is the fact that this character archetype is in almost every single thing he makes from Combat Mecha Xabungle on, which is wild because it's not like a mandatory one. I mean, we could obviously also put in the like, sort of slightly like hot-headed, boy who's, kind of in over his head and has his frustrations with the world and the hypocrisies of the world. And that's in most of these as well. but that's the main character. So it's like,
Right.
it's, you know, it makes sense that he has a similar kind of protagonist in all these shows that are in the same genre, that are all targeting the same broad demographic, that are dealing with similar themes, that he would have a similar kind of young male protagonist that has some similar character traits. But it's very distinctive to me that this kind of supporting character slash antagonist, you know, slash sometimes an almost co-lead, like where their position in the show sometimes shifts, but the plot and the character development and the vibes are all so similar. And it's just very fascinating when you really lay it out that he is just like stuck on this idea about this notion of women. And again, I think exactly what it means and how it's used evolves, but the sense of women being controlled or manipulated by some sort of patriarchal misogynistic system, and that being used to turn them against the people trying to help them. But also this sense of like personal betrayal that I think comes with it, and this like struggle with desiring a kind of relationship, whether it's a romantic one or a more kind of familial one with these women, and that being like denied. That there's, I think, a very like powerful feeling there that he's really exploring.
And I think it's also, in every one of these cases, it's about this question of agency. It's about this question of like, what things can women do in these worlds? What agency do they have relative to the protagonist and to the larger structure? And what will they take? What will they be given? Like, all of that is wrapped up in there. I mean, Katajina's story is like really this. It's kind of this to this like dark nth degree. And I think what's interesting is that the thing that is missing most of all in the Elchi version of it is, I think, the question of agency. Because if you make one change at the beginning of this story and have it be Elchi run away from the Iron Gear and then like go to the innocent, maybe not expecting to be brainwashed, but then it happens, but there was some betrayal on her part at the start, this entire story is different. And I think a lot of it becomes a lot richer and a lot less flat. And I think that is the kind of missing ingredient that is there. Like when you get to 4 Murasame and Zeta Gundam, the like mystery undergirding her story and what Camille is trying to uncover about her is how much agency she has over her own emotions and actions, right? Yeah. And like that is also a question in Xabungle that like you've got the people on the Iron Gear debating, but we in the audience know it's not actually a question because we know Elchi doesn't want any of this. Hasn't chosen any of this, that her true self is somewhere deeper in there, and it is the person who was friends with these people. And I think that is like the interesting tension going on in these episodes of Xabungle.
Absolutely. And yeah, that like there's a lot of things that the other versions of this do to like change this. Because the thing you're saying is that's what Rekoa's story is in Zeta, yeah. Right? That you have this kind of slow burn with this character, where obviously Rekoa is not as important in Zeta Gundam as Elchi, but she's in most of the show. I mean, she's introduced at the very beginning. She kind of is on and off the main crew at certain points because she's sometimes off in other missions. But you do have this slow burn story with Rekoa where you see how she is not satisfied with the way things are going at that crew. She's this person who like has no real kind of like place in the world. She wants this kind of relationship with Quattro Bagina, who's certainly not Shara's novel. I don't know why people think that. He's clearly a different guy. Look at those sunglasses. Shara would never wear those. And Quattro Bagina is, let's say, not the most emotionally available person that anyone's ever encountered in their life. And so she just has this sort of a lack of real attachment to the like bigger cause. She has a lack of real attachment to the people there, and that creates this sort of like gap where Paptimus can come in, Shiroko can come in and manipulate her and pull her over to that side. Because she's this person who feels very lost, and that is built up very clearly and deliberately over the course of Zeta Gundam. That makes it that when the betrayal happens, it is both shocking, but it's also very understandable. You can see why it happens. And Camille immediately blames Char/Quattro for it and all this kind of stuff. And that's something that's missing here with Elchi, is that there is a, like, the seed of it could be there. And they kind of play with it a little bit because there's the whole idea of culture and the thing that she's obsessed with, the idea of culture, and she has this fascination with, and this kind of almost worship of the innocent and what she thinks is culture that they have. And there's like a clear story to be told about her fully just sort of seeing Jiron and Rag and just peeling away from the Iron Gear, going to the Innocent, and really giving herself over to them, and then becoming an agent of the Innocent, that then they like pull her in too far. And I think there's a story there in, the little elements of that are here in Xabungle, I think, are very effective. I mean, one of my favorite moments with Elchi in the second half of the show is near the end, when the dancing girls that are on the Iron Gear put on their little puppet shows that they were doing at the very beginning. We haven't seen them do in like 30 episodes or something. And that is one of the main things that pulls Elchi out of her kind of, fugue state, that all these other things of like, Jiren trying to serenade her and all this other shit that other people are trying to do just does not work. And the only thing that gets through is this like real expression of actual culture that we now know that the Innocent don't really have, because one, there's not that many of them, and two, most of them are pieces of shit. And they are very militaristic, and they have this sort of, kind of stagnated fascist kind of lack of culture. And the things that she was doing with the crew is a real expression of culture. And so I think like some of those ideas are there, but they're so sort of like vague and not like really explored. And there's just a couple of moments, and most of that dynamic with Elchi is just lost for huge stretches of the second half of the show, which is very frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I wanted to talk about, is that I think we mentioned last week when we talked about the first half of the show that you end those first 26 episodes with Jiron and Rag having evolved along a very clear arc to land in a certain place, while Elchi's character is still quite a bit more unsettled. And I think my biggest disappointment with the second half of Xabungle is that Elchi who exists in episodes 1 through 26 is just taken off the board. She kind of ceases to exist. She kind of ceases to have a character arc, because the thing that is so compelling about her by the end of episode 26 is that she does understand the value of this found family. She does know the Innocent are pieces of shit. Like, she intellectually understands what they are, and she is resistant to admitting all of it. That's where she is at the end of episode 26, right? I think she understands the field in the same way the others do, and she doesn't want to admit it because she is still clinging to this more childish notion of what the Innocent are and what her life could be in that form of cultured luxury, right? And that is the perfect setting to have a character make a betrayal. To have a character do, and this is like dramatically satisfying, to have a character do something they know somewhere inside them is wrong, but they choose to do anyway. And I think that's why it was so kind of bizarre to me to get into episode 27, 28 and have this happen to her without her taking any hand in it, because it would become such an interesting character thing. If, like, obviously the Innocent would go too far and she would become something that she never wanted to become. But then if you had Jiron saying, no, guys, we've got to save Elchi, the real Elchi is in there, and you have Rag saying, shut up, Jiron, she betrayed us, she never mattered, blah, blah, blah. Then you would have a debate where both Jiron and Rag are both right and both wrong, and then it's a real debate where the viewer has to go, oh man, which character is right? Whereas in the series as it plays, Jiron is the one with compassion, and Rag sounds like a fucking psychopath for parts of this show, with like not wanting to do anything about Elchi, who has been just brutally victimized. And so I think that's where, like, there's complicated character dynamics that are very, very Tomino-esque going on in the first half of this show that get pretty heavily jettisoned in the way they do the brainwashing story.
Exactly. I mean, I think one of the other like key things that kind of like prevents them from doing it the way that he kind of does later is they also have, little moments in the early part of the arc where she like actually tries to get away, right? Where she's like pretending to be under the brainwashing and is attempting to escape from the Innocent. And then at the last minute, it kind of takes hold. And that's part of that thing that makes it feel like she is just purely a victim in this, and that there isn't that like, where it becomes a lot harder to see the brainwashing as a kind of metaphorical expression, which is what it comes across in the equivalent characters in Gundam. That it's like what Padma Shirako does to Rekoa in manipulating her. Yes, there's like psychic new typey shit to it, but that feels like it is a narrative expression of this broader idea of the way in which misogynistic patriarchal figures use the tools of patriarchy in order to manipulate and control women. Right, and it's like you're not, I don't think that Tomino cares that much about like the real, like whatever like psychic bullshit is in a quote unquote real context. It's used as a narrative tool to explore metaphorical ideas, and it's also just like a narrative convenience to have certain things happen in a way that the audience can buy into without having to spend lots and lots of time on it. And yeah, there's just something about the way that it happens with Elchi, with all those different elements where she feels so fully victimized that you kind of can't take the person who comes out of the brainwashing particularly serious in a narrative sense the way you can with Katejina-san, in Victory Gundam in particular. And I think one of the things that Victory Gundam does that's very effective is that we are pulled away from Katejina's POV for a significant chunk of time, and she comes back like this. I mean, you get little bits of her with Chronicle and stuff like that, who's the guy who kidnaps her. And so you get little windows into the process about which it happens, but there's a really key gap that we do not see. And then she reappears and she is like piloting a mobile suit and she's trying to kill Uso. And Uso and the audience are like, what the fucking fuck has happened here? Because it's such a huge jump. And it's a thing that creates a really interesting dramatic scenario where the audience then is trying to piece together along with Uso like what has happened to Katejina, and also like who was she really the whole time? And you kind of restart thinking about some of the weirder, kind of odd things she said and did in the first sections of the show, and it all becomes recontextualized by the way that character evolved. And a big issue with Elchi is that she's so central to the storyline as one of our three lead characters and has been since the very beginning that like I very much understand why the show just does not pull away from her POV ever. And I don't think there's any episode where you don't see Elchi. You're always kind of revisiting her. You're constantly seeing that progress. And so even when you get what is like still a very good episode, I think, which is the episode where Jiron and Blume and BL sneak into the dome or whatever, and this is where Jiron fully confronts completely 80s up, fucking jazz instructor Elchi, that has the vibes of the kind of that sequence near the middle of Victory Gundam where Uso reconfronts Katejina-san. But because we have seen even earlier in that episode, like the detailed, all like her training, and they've made the whole army that she's leading and all that kind of stuff, and we have seen this version of the character pretty extensively at that point, it's a shock for Jiron. It's not a shock for the audience in any way, shape, or form, and it ends up being dramatically kind of limp and doesn't give you this sort of like distance through which you can kind of question and explore what is being said here and what has happened with the character and what this character kind of means or signifies. You're just not given that opportunity really, and it's disappointing.
And I think this is where it also flattens our other two protagonists, Jiron and Rag, over the course of the second half of the show, because Jiron, I think, is 100% correct in his motivations. The problem is that those motivations have no space to evolve. Once Elchi is kidnapped, he wants to save Elchi. He should want to save Elchi. That is like the right moral thing for our hero to want to do. He has this speech later in the show where he talks about finding her pitiable and like how much he empathizes with this horrible thing that I think is a really good piece of writing and like is very true to who the character is. The problem is that there's no space for evolution within that until it gets complicated in some major way, which it never really does. And then for Rag, even as that character is evolving in some ways, like we see her become a really good like military commander in this half. We see her having to grapple with like her attraction to the salt guy, Katakam Zushim, and like how much is that attraction versus how much is he actually a good dude, which he really kind of isn't. And so you have all of that. She's like becomes very, very loyal to her crew to a point that she becomes almost myopic about other things. But then with this like issue of Elchi and Jiron and all that, she regresses way back before like she was in like episode 26 at the end of that first half of the series, because she has to be the person pushing back against Jiron. And again, Jiron is just objectively correct in what he wants to do because it is so clearly the right thing, and there's no space for the audience to get into that argument. And because those dynamics don't shift, we don't save Elchi until the last 2 episodes of the series. Like, that is one thing, is that happened so late that it needed to happen, like, you needed to have a good 5 or 6 episodes with restored Elchi at the end of this thing for it to work, not just 2, because it means that the character dynamics, there's about 22 episodes where Jiron and Rag's, like, fundamental motivations are completely static, even as a lot of other cool world-building stuff is happening around them that is changing the status quo in fascinating, fun ways.
Yeah, and along with that, you have, a kind of core plot dynamic of the show is the love triangle between these 3 characters.
Yeah.
And that also then becomes static and kind of just confusing at a certain point, because it's like, at some point, Jiron seems to have fallen in love with Elchi. It's like, it just becomes like very odd when he starts like doing these things of like, oh, but it's me, it's your beloved Jiron, and he keeps on saying something like, "Omae no itoshi Jiron dazo," and you're like, at what point did he like start going full in that direction? Just becomes like a little odd, because it's just, there's no interaction with her because she's off the show, or off, not off the show, but off of like that side of the show, the protagonist side of the show, for the entire second half. And that's where, like, you need to have more time with her in her kind of regular form. Also, like, time with her in a regular form where we're not in the middle of a giant fucking pitched battle, which we are for like the last 10 episodes or something. I mean, it just goes on forever. That there's no downtime with her once she comes back to normal. That also, there's no sense of like, how has this love triangle element evolved? It's just kind of, I was left very perplexed by it by the end of the show. And it just feels like it got pushed to this Jiron and Elchi get paired up together at the end, just because he was so committed to trying to rescue her. But he started trying to rescue her not because he's in love with her, but because there was like an ethical, like, this is what we should do, she is our ally, it's wrong. It was a regular Jiron kind of thing, and at some point it had this weird romantic association with it in the writing that I was very confused by.
I think that's all fair. And yeah, and this is where I talked earlier about how the structure of these episodes is pretty disciplined, and like every 4 or 5 episodes have a big status quo shift. The ending of the show is where that breaks down, where like the last 5 episodes, the big status quo shift is in the anti-penultimate episode where Elchi is restored, and there should be like 5 or 6 episodes after that, but there's 2. And that's where, like, again, this kind of flatness invades, where you're talking about the romance and the triangle, Sean, like, even the ending is very non-committal about it, because the ending is, it's very comedic, but it is this big romantic moment between Jiron and Elchi that then Fat Man comes in miraculously revived, impossibly miraculously revived, and he runs off with Elchi, and then Rag steals a kiss, so it's actually completely unresolved still at the end, and we're kind of back to just whatever the status quo was.
Yes. It's just, it is very frustrating watching the second half in that sense of this, like, the way in which that Elchi's arc just is totally frozen in place for 20 episodes, basically, until finally it starts to thaw out, and then the show's over. And it's where you just can feel that, like, again, I think Tomino had this idea for this kind of character arc, this like kind of storyline he wanted to do, but really didn't know exactly how it should go. And he learned from this, because obviously, like, he does it a lot more, and they're all very interesting in different evolutions of this. But this first time out, it's a very strange thing.
Yeah, because there are still compelling elements of it, right? The
Yes.
character is still very striking. The basic drama of having to fight a friend is always going to be, like, interesting and compelling. It is around the edges and around the pacing and the structure that this gets kind of broken down.
Well, it just, like, happens 10 episodes longer than it needs to.
Yes, yeah.
Like,
yeah.
if it went through to the, like, they sneak in with Beale and stuff, they see her, BL dies, they run away. Now there's like this, how the fuck do we save this person who's, it's not just about trying to get her out of the clutches of the innocent. Now it's that she's actively trying to kill us. Then you've got some confrontations between the Iron Gear and Elchi, and then amongst those, she's then saved, and then you enter the final stage of let's go deal with the innocent, and Elchi's an active part of the crew for the last 10 episodes or something. I think would have been a really great storyline, but it's the kind of repetitiveness of we're continuing to have to fight Elchi. I mean, how many times does Fat Man like run out to go get Elchi, and Jiren goes out as well? You know, it's just you keep on repeating the same episodic plots. Then around the edges of that, other things are moving, but that core dynamic just gets stuck on such a loop. And it's very frustrating because if it was cut down and the show moved on from it much earlier, I think like this character arc could have been perfectly fine and could have worked well. It's just the fact that it gets stuck in a loop on it is why it breaks down.
I agree with that, and I would also say that is a symptom of a larger problem in the second half of this show, where a lot of things wind up getting stuck on a loop, because if you look at the first half of Xabungle, it is structured more like other Tomino shows, where you have this kind of cadre of sub-bosses, you could call them, that we move through, right? So like you have a couple of episodes with Miss Gabulette, or Gabulette Gaboulet, however you say her crazy name, and you move through that, and she dies, and that's over. You do that with the big man character, he dies, that's over. You do that with Karras and Greta Karras and Frank Karras, all of his, like, there's not Frank Karras, but he has a whole family of Karras people.
Bill Karras, Gary Karras, all, the whole Karrases. They're all here for Thanksgiving.
And most of them die, other than Greta. Greta inexplicably comes back later in this show. We can talk about that later. But, like, each of those arcs ends, and then we move on to the next thing. And the problem in the second half of this show is that we have an ever-growing cadre of those sub-bosses, and no one is ever resolved. So, like, we go into the final episode with Timp, Kid Horla, Greta Karras, Biram, Doas, and several other of, like, the major, like, sub-villains of the show, all still on the board, while we also have to go deal with the ultimate villain, Kashim King. It would be like if you went into the ending of Gundam with every single member of the Zabi family still alive. And not just every member of the Zabi family, but then, like, Ramba Ral is still there, and just, like, every other sub-boss we'd met is kind of still there.
The Black Tri-Stars come out, and they're doing the jet stream attack still, and you're just like, man, we're at Abaku. Like, come on, guys. Like, Jesus.
Exactly, and it creates this for Xabungle, it creates this real sense of, like, repetition, and the sense that nothing ever gets resolved. Because it also means that none of those characters really get endings. Like, like, Timp's ending is kind of the most that they put a mark on it, because you have the whole crew come out and collectively fight him off. But there's no real, like, thematic resolution to him and Jiron, and I don't need that thematic resolution to be Jiron killing him, to be clear. Like, if the ending is Jiron no longer cares about retribution because he's got all these other people he cares about, that's a good resolution. It's not consciously what the show gives us. Kid Horla is the one that I feel like Kid Horla needed to die in episode 25 or 26, first half of this show. He is a real drain, I think, on the series in its second half. There is, I will admit, a great running gag in the finale where they keep cutting back to recycled, and it's like consciously recycled animation of Horla with Garaba on the edge of this cliff going, God damn it, I'm missing the most exciting scene, and they keep cutting to it, and that is a very funny gag, but I think you have to go through a lot of shoe leather with Horla, doing nothing, achieving nothing, and never being defeated, despite, like, blowing up in a fucking nuclear explosion 7 times. And that's where it's like, there's way too much repetition with these extra characters along the side for it to ever feel like we have true forward momentum.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And because part of the other thing that it ends up creating is this weird sensation of, like, you then go long stretches where, one of them is not in the show. It's like, and then you go like 7 episodes and we haven't seen Temp, and you're like, is Temp Sharon ever going to come back? And then, like, all of a sudden, then someone mentions him off screen at some point. You're like, I guess he's still around. And then all of a sudden he's back at a certain point. And there is just this weird sense of characters just kind of get put on ice for long periods of time and then just get kind of pulled back out to come in. But at that point, all the drama they built up around that character has kind of died off, because I think when Temp comes back early on in all the Salt stuff, and you've got the skiing fucking walkers and all that shit, which is great, it's very exciting, and you're, like, really stoked to see Temp Sharon back in, and you have this like the running joke of him wanting everyone to call him captain because now he's captain of his own ship because he was always this kind of like lone merc up till this point, and nobody ever wants to call him captain. And you have just a bunch of great fucking cigar gags and stuff like that. Yes. Where he's constantly burning himself in new interesting ways. And I would remember just being very, very happy when he came back, and then he just kind of disappears for a long time. Then he just kind of comes back in, then he disappears, he comes back in. And it would have been much more satisfying if they dealt with him, and it's like, either do something to move him into a totally different position in the show where he's, turn him into a Char/Vegeta-like character where he's either on the main character's side or sort of, and he's also fighting the innocent. I would be fine with that, or kill him off. Or have a definitive kind of conclusion and have him not on the show anymore. Same thing with Kid Horla, where there are, there's a decent stretch of episodes where with the dynamic between him and Elchi is interesting because they're technically both on the same side, but it just keeps happening. And you're just like waiting for, well, there needs to be some kind of resolution to this character. And it just never comes. The character disappears. And then by the time they bring them back in, whatever kind of interesting plot stuff was happening with him is now gone. And the opportunity to have an interesting resolution of that character no longer really exists anymore because all of the plot momentum they had built up around him has totally dried off in the period he's no longer on screen.
Yeah, and it undermines what is Tomino's structural superpower, which is the way, and this is like Gundam is the show that solidifies this, but then he starts doing it in every other show, is the way he weaponizes both the pleasure of formulaic episodic television, where you have like elements that are going to get doled out every week, and you're going to have episodes that have their own internal structure while contributing to the larger structure. But then he also weaponizes the pleasures of serialized storytelling, where you're able to have things like meaningfully change and evolve over the course of things. So Gundam, 79 has this kind of like funnel-esque structure, where it's through these formulaic repetitions is pushing us down the funnel as it narrows, where you have, sort of broad strokes early on, and with every sort of sub-boss or like, arc villain that you sort of defeat or move past or have some kind of definitive resolution to, you're focusing our attention further and further in towards like our core group of characters, their core group of issues, what the fundamental stakes of this thing are, until you arrive at Abaoku at the end, and every character who is still left standing has a major resolution to their character arc that also resolves the entire story of the series. I think Ideon does this, maybe not quite as neatly as Gundam does, but especially when you put back in Ideon Be Invoked, you get that again. We know his future Gundam shows are going to do this, and Xabungle, I think in the first half feels like it's doing that, but then it ultimately abandons it, and it just kind of keeps widening and staying at one point, and it never funnels itself the way it needs to. So even though these episodes are still very good at the episodic Tomino formulaic structure thing of like, the action is very fun, the episodes move really fast, it's a breeze to watch and to binge, you don't have that like sense of focusing as we go down the home stretch. That is the thing that makes Tomino shows better than anyone else's.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like the key ingredient to the Tomino style finale, and having that like incredible culminated rush of like everything comes together in such a perfect and precise way and very calculated feeling way. And that just doesn't really occur here.
Yeah. Another thing that like when we talk about Zeta Gundam, we have to talk about, because Zeta is arguably the best version of that in terms of like the fireworks finale where everything happens, but it's all built to so well. So yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for listening to Japanimation Station. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to like and subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell your friends.
You can also find us over at the Purely Academic Podcast, our potentially educational variety show where we talk video games, movies, TV, and more every month. And you can read my movie reviews and follow everything we release together on the Fade to Lack Substack at www.jonathanlack.com.
And now, back to the show.
I did want to talk about one other thing before we maybe move on to some other larger discussions. Is last week when we talked about part 1, we discussed the influence of Miyazaki Hayao's Future Boy Conan on Combat Mecha Xabungle. But what I found interesting is it's actually much, much more pronounced in this final batch of episodes as we fully learn the backstory of the Innocent. So if you've never seen Future Boy Conan, in that show, Earth's surface was decimated after a high-tech war. Basically, they don't call it nuclear war, but this was made in the 70s. It's a nuclear holocaust scenario. And then you have one ship escapes the atmosphere into low orbit and then returns to a lone island, which is where Conan the hero is born, and our story starts when he's, like 12 years old. The Innocent, basically, we learn through the lore dumps in the second half of Xabungle, are that exact idea, but on a much bigger scale, because they are the survivors of humanity having left Earth not for a couple of years, but for thousands of years. They've presumably gone and colonized the stars. I like to imagine that this is the same universe as Space Runaway Idion, and these are the other humans are out there somewhere, and Xabungle is happening off in a corner. And 5 minutes after the end of Xabungle, they also get raptured in what happens in Idion. That's a fun headcanon you can do. But in any case, as in Conan, those who live on the altered Earth wind up regressing to earlier technologies, and when we near the end of the story and get to the kind of heart of what the Innocent made, we start seeing high-tech stuff again, like satellites, computers, and solar power. In Conan, which is all about solar power, that's centralized in the main tower, Solar Tower, and the scene with the Innocence Tower in Eternal Valley in episode 45 is like an extremely conscious homage to the Solar Tower stuff in Conan, particularly in one of the last episodes of Conan where the tower, they finally get solar power again and everything comes back on. There's a series of shots in Eternal Valley where Tomino is tipping his hat to Miyazaki there. And in a broader sense, the idea of one generation having to make decisions about sort of how much of their advanced technology should survive or be given to those living on this new Earth is sort of the animating question in the lore of both of these shows. And Miyazaki is very much at his most anti-tech in Conan, so he ends that series with all of it being taken offline and destroyed. The new generation is encouraged to go live in harmony with the land. I think another issue with Xabungle is it doesn't really land on a thematic resolution to that all that much. And so I would have said the first half of Xabungle is better structured as a TV show than Conan was. But the thing about Conan is that its second half is spectacular and gets just better and better until the ending. And so it has kind of the opposite issues Xabungle has. And so Conan is a much more canonical show because of that. But it is interesting to see those comparisons kind of come to fruition in the second half of this series.
Yeah, and I do like within Xabungle, I like what they do with the that larger storyline. I think there's a lot of potential that doesn't fully get paid off there, but the sense of the Innocent, coming back to this destroyed Earth and these them wanting to build up this group of people to inherit it, which is what the civilians are. But then obviously there are these two different factions within the Innocent, where you have Arthur Rank, who wants to fulfill this mission, who's his idea for what we should do is build up this future generation and have them inherit the Earth and take it forward, which is obviously this a very Tomino theme of the we must make a better world for the people that come after us, and fight for these kind of future generations. But then you have Kashim and his faction, which are entirely about trying to hoard all the power that they have and keep it inside and live in their little bubbles. And there's almost a little bit of an intimation. They don't full go into it, but almost kind of like the Jordan Peele movie Get Out, where there's this sense of part of Elchi's brainwashing is putting in another personality, and they discover that is Kashim King's personality. And I thought where that was ultimately going to go was that their idea was to build up this race of people who can live on the Earth and just put my personality in their body and move on and have kind of literally overtake them and play off of those themes. And I do think that idea is still kind of there, but it's there's just so much shit going on into the show because they've got 50 different characters they need to do stuff with that it never fully goes into that idea. But I thought there was a really interesting story here about this, these two alternate kind of approaches to the way that people who hold power try to, kind of, what do they do? You have this kind of very naive but very noble character in Arthur Rank who has this almost kind of noblesse oblige kind of idea, and he does want to fulfill these very kind of noble things, but he's been incredibly passive his entire fucking life and let this fascist old piece of shit take control of basically everything and allowed himself to be this kind of puppet figure until he finally is freed by the civilians and Jiren and friends. And at that point, he's actually trying to take action and kind of make his ideals a reality. But in the meantime, you had this person whose entire goal is to secure power, control power for himself very selfishly for this like very small population of people. Is one of the things I like about the Innocent at the end of the show is you get the sense that there's like, I don't know, like 100 something of these people. Like there's clearly not that many Innocent that actually live on this planet. It's this like very small population that have all these like weird robot people and stuff that make it look like there's a bunch of people living in these domes. But when you actually see them, it's just like a tiny handful of people that are trying to hoard all the wealth, all the luxury of this entire planet just to themselves, and use the civilians basically as a form of like pseudo slave labor to get them all the resources that they need. And like that whole dynamic at the end of the show and how it works into the revolution is all stuff I enjoyed.
Totally, and it's another place where I think if you had been able to disentangle the Elchi stuff from the actual resolution of the series, I would have liked a final arc that like focused on this more, because I love this half of the world building. I think Arthur Rank is a great character. I like that you are introduced to Arthur as one of the two leaders, and you have Arthur Rank and you have Kashim King, and you kind of don't think anything of it because Arthur is the one who looks kingly. He looks regal, right? And you have Kashim, who is like the advisor figure off in the corner. But then as you start to learn about this situation, you realize, oh, okay, Arthur is walking the walk. He believes what he believes. Or he believes what he says, and he's legitimate about it, and everyone starts to think like maybe he's an ally. But then you learn the horrible truth, which is that Arthur does believe that, but not everyone else does, and you have this other faction being led by that sort of evil vizier figure in Kashim King, who is sort of like reneging on all these promises that the Innocent have made, all of these sort of ideals that they have. And I think that's a really fascinating complication of all of the sort of economic metaphors that you have in the first half of the show with the Innocent, the kind of like questioning the sort of the ideals of this kind of like capitalist hierarchy, like what it claims to be versus what it actually is. All of that stuff is really good. I think it gets crowded out a little bit in the repetition of all of the Elchi stuff, which I think is too bad. But I do like those characters a lot. And Arthur, basically the best scenes of part 2 of this show are when Arthur is on screen. He's awesome.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think like just his whole dynamic of this kind of, you know, the like seemingly and is like very frail kind of prince character. But then I love like how he's down to fucking go, you know, like There's that great episode where he just goes kind of crazy and like storms the bubble to go kill Kashim King, and he pulls out his, like, he gets the Jiren's gun and is shouting shit. It's like Kashim King, like, as the representative of the Innocents, it's my responsibility to kill you. And he's just fucking trying to blast the dude. Like there's a real kind of like passion to the character that is very surprising because on the surface you don't see it. And then when it comes out, it's very cool.
Well, and it's part of why his story works so well is that it's a story with a beginning, middle, and end. We meet him in one place, he evolves to another place, and then he goes and fucking, like, dies for something. And, you know, I don't need every Tomino show to be a bloodbath, to be clear. And we've seen plenty of Tomino shows that don't have a ton of character deaths that are among his best works, like Rekkengiste and G and Turn A Gundam, right? But, like, you still need some. It is a spice that is required, I think, for his form of storytelling, if for no other reason that, again, that kind of funnel structure that he, you know, kind of inaugurates with Gundam requires that you move past and have resolutions at various points in the story. And Arthur's works really well because he gets all of that in the midst of other characters not having it. And it's just it's a reminder of, like, you don't just need characters to die to, you know, satiate your bloodlust. There's a dramatic principle behind it that, like, needs to be honored as well. Even if it's not through death, resolution has to come.
Yeah, and I do think that that's might be my favorite moment in the entire second half of the show is Arthur, you know, doing this thing, saving Elchi, then jumping out of the fucking Iron Gear, blowing up. Jiren gets to have his big dramatic Tomino character speech of, you know, screaming at the stars, basically, you know, your kind of Camille Cosmo moment. And then that immediately be juxtaposed with the fucking massive missile coming up from above and blowing up the, like, I forget his name, but like the nice guy who's just a small supporting character who had come in from early in the show, and he's like kind of rejoined with Salt, and him and all those people get blown to fucking smithereens. And Jiro
Is that Caldus Bruin?
Yes.
I think I like that name. I just like saying that name.
Yes. And Jiren then is like faced with the reality of the kind of destruction that the previous civilization had access to. You know, there's a big kind of theme in the back section of the show about like history and the way that history informs like culture and politics and all these things. And in order to make change in the world, you need to understand the history of how it came to be to this place. And that's one of the things that Arthur does, is convey this history and help the civilians get access to this larger sense of history and culture that they are a part of, that they have been that has been denied to them by the innocent for their entire lives. And then you get this like window into another part of that history when this bomb drops, and also that sense of that Kashim King himself doesn't really understand that history either. Like, he himself is kind of ignorant of these missiles and what they mean and what they signify or how to use them. And it ends up being, you know, the cause of his own death is him using these kind of like ancient, decayed, like implied to be effectively nuclear, like, you know, something like that missiles. I mean, they're intercontinental ballistic missiles that they're pulling out of museums. They don't really know how to fucking use them. They're these giant crazy things, and it's just blowing people to smithereens almost at random because they don't even know how to fucking aim the things. And they're probably malfunctioning even if they did know how to aim them. And that like, it's such a incredible dramatic moment of the, like, that sense of the horrible nature of where this stuff can go if we are like ignorant, evil motherfuckers like Kashim King is. And that all being immediately following Arthur's death. It's such a great dramatic moment. A la, you know, it's not as good as this, but it's similar to Lala's death immediately then after you get the solar ray vaporizing Degen Zabi and the Admiral for the Earth Federation side, General Revel, and Amr running out and saying, it's the light of death. In Cosmic Glow, there's a similar sense of this like kind of two-stage climax, one that's very personal, and then one that shows like this violence on a grandiose scale, a way in which the characters have never considered up till that moment.
Absolutely. Well, do you want to talk about some of our new characters that we have in this half? We just started doing it, but I also want to shout out the voice actors, because again, in the way this feels like a season 2, we get basically a whole new cadre of voice actors coming in and doing stuff in this half of the show, and they're all very good. Particularly, again, Arthur Rank, who we just talked about. That is the man, the myth, the legend, Shiozawa Kanato, who we have talked. He just like comes up in everything we talk about, even though he sadly died young around the turn of the millennium. But he was a beloved actor within the industry, clearly just an incredible talent. We last talked about him as Jolliver and the narrator in Space Runaway Ideon. This is like the perfect Shiozawa Kanato role, the kind of like pretty boy who's hiding more underneath. Like, that kind of character is the kind of person he played so well, and it is a tremendous performance.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, anytime you can have Shiozawa Kanato, he was just so good. And as you say, like, it's one of the kinds of characters he was particularly good at, and his voice has that very distinctive quality. So yeah, it's a great character, great performance.
And the way they dole him out is so knowing. Like, I think, because at this point, Tomino had worked with him several times, because he's Makuve in Gundam, he's the narrator in Ideon, and like, your first couple of appearances of Arthur are very brief and kind of off to the side, and you'll go many episodes without hearing from him again, but just having Shiozawa's voice on screen for like the 5 seconds when he first talks to Jiron, when Jiron invades, I think it's J Point, and everyone has abandoned it, and he talks to Arthur for like 5 seconds. That scene works because you have an actor of this caliber coming in and like impressing upon you who this person is, so that when we then spend 15 episodes trying to get back to him, there's a lot of dramatic tension there.
Yes, absolutely. Like, he's just one of those actors whose voice carries so much weight, even though it's not like a very, you know, gravelly voice or anything like that. But it's just, there's so much kind of charisma and it's true of like every character he plays. I mean, you know, like one of the other big ones for us, even though it's not actually a character that has all that much screen time, is Makabe in Gundam. And there's a similar kind of thing of like, Makabe is actually a relatively minor character. He's not in that much of Mobile Suit Gundam, but that dude makes such a huge fucking impression, in no small part because of how much charisma Shirozawa Kanato's voice imbues in that character. And I think there's this very similar thing happening with Arthur here, you know, with a good guy versus a bad guy character. But it's not a character that has a lot of screen time. He's only in a relatively small stretch of the show, but any amount of screen time he has a huge amount of weight and like is very memorable to the audience, because I think Shirozawa is so good at giving such life to his characters.
It's why, you know, we also talked about him in Lupin the Third, the Fuma Conspiracy, which is the Lupin OVA that recast all of the Japanese voices for one time. And some of those recasts work, some of them don't. The one that definitely worked was Shiozawa, who plays Goemon, because Goemon is the strong silent type, but when he talks, you want to feel like you're paying attention, and that's who this guy is, right?
Yeah.
Kashim King is voiced by Ogata Kenichi, who was Denim in Mobile Suit Gundam, but for our purposes, most importantly, he was Shamisen the cat in The Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi. I also noted in your notes he was Tokechi in the 9th episode of Dirty Pair. I don't remember who that is, but I thought I'd put it on the list.
You know, it's always good to have, I mean, if we put everyone from the 80s who was also or everyone in a show from the 80s that was also an episode of Dirty Pair, going to be marking down most people, because there's a lot. But yes, like Shamisen, obviously legendary vocal performance. And I'm not even saying that as a joke. It is like just such an incredible moment in quote unquote season 2 of Haruhi, however you want to fucking talk about it, but in the movie episodes, the cat just starts talking. You're like, what the fuck? It's funny that he voiced Denim from Mobile Suit Gundam, because there's one thing that I find very funny about Kashim King is it does feel like Kogawa Tomonori, the character designer, just pulled the fucking character design for Degwin Zabi from Mobile Suit Gundam and refreshed it up for Xabungle, because the dude looks fucking exactly like Degwin Zabi from Gundam. It's a very, very funny to me how much that character resembles Degwin.
We also have another one of our new innocent villains here is Biram Ki. Again, Tomino's, you know, he's good at names no matter what. And this is kind of the character who replaces Beal as the main administrator character. And this is voiced by Totani Koji, who is a very prolific character actor who does basically one voice in at least every Gundam and Tomino production. And I'm going to list them just because it allows me to say Tomino names for a couple minutes here, Sean. So please, if you'll allow me, Totani Koji was also Kozun and Uragan in Gundam 79, Kakrikon Kakuler and Geidi Kinsei in Zeta Gundam, Goten Go and August Gidan in Double Zeta, Alpha A Bate in Gundam 0083, Colonel Killing in Gundam 0080, and Tooth in Gundam Char's Counterattack. We will also see him as Hasha Moja and Bada in Heavy Metal Elgime, and Tokamak Rovsky and Dolpul Giron in Aura Battler Dunbine.
Those are some good games. I remember Capricorn from Zeta.
Yeah, it's just such good names. He also is in a bunch of Dragon Ball stuff. He's Dracula Man in Dragon Ball, Kiwi and Ginger in Dragon Ball Z, Don Kier in Dragon Ball GT, and he was the original voice of Mitsuru's dad, Takaharu, in the PS2 release of Persona 3, although sadly he had to be replaced in later adaptations because he died in February 2006, just before that game came out. I like Biram as a character. He's one of those like sub-bosses who I think needed to be taken off the board earlier in the show, but he is like, he's our first real indication of how shitty the innocent are, because he's the person who deposes Beal, who is like the idealistic version of this character, and then kind of takes his role and starts doing all the shitty things to Elchi and other characters, and he plays a very effective dirtbag here.
Yeah, I think there's something about Biram that he's just this, like, unassuming middle manager type guy, you know, that he's not at the top of the rung, but he's not going to question anything that like the people above him try to like bring down. And so the contrast between him and BL, I think, is very effective, because BL is, you know, you don't trust him or when you first meet him, because you know that there's sketchy shit going on with the innocent, but he is this very likable kind of figure, and you can understand why Elchi becomes very obsessed with him in the first half of the show. And then obviously he becomes a sort of like pseudo-heroic figure in the second half here. And Biram, who replaces him, is like, in a good way, a very unmemorable character, in the sense of like he's just this like slime bag who's just going through the motions of the upper, you know, hierarchy of the innocent. not questioning, not thinking about anything other than just doing what he's basically told. And I think like he's a very effective character in that sense. And there's a great scene I love near the end of the show where he is like in the point that's being the point Z or whatever that's being attacked at the very end of the show, and you've got Timp on the fucking like one video call, and you've got Cash and King on the other, and Byrm's having to kind of talk to both of them, and it's a very great comedic scene about him trying to like manage all these fucking people, and he's just like. And there's just a real like I just fucking work here energy to this guy that's both great and despicable that I really love.
Absolutely. That's a good way to put it. Absolutely. Moving on to, here's a part of the show we haven't really talked about yet, but you have the organization SALT that we are introduced to at the very beginning of this stretch of episodes. It's another way this kind of feels like a season 2, because episode 27, where we start, is where you first hear about SALT, and you have all of that stuff. And this is, I think, the part of the show that maybe on the whole works best for me in the second half, is the gradual evolution of the Iron Gear going from this ragtag group of loners who are out for themselves to becoming not just part of this larger organization, but then eventually the leaders of this larger organization who take down the innocent. And I think all of the stages along that evolution are really fun. You know, the initial stuff where they're not sure if they trust Salt. Then you have the entire arc with a character we're about to talk about, Katakam Zushim, about kind of like wrestling control away from people who don't really know what they're doing, onto the finale arc where, you know, now you have this basically the Iron Gear is the head of an entire fleet, which changes a lot of like the strategy and battle calculus in a really cool way. And I love this whole half of the show a lot.
Yes, I think like absolutely. This is the part of exactly what the second half of Xabungle should be. Like I think it's such a clear continuation from the first half that arrives at this point, you know, we talked about last week of all the crew, you know, that was this like disparate group of people who have no real need to be together, or there's no necessity for them to be together. But they realize that there is some sort of like emotional thing that they need, this like kind of connection. And especially as they like start to discover the nature of the innocent's control on their lives, that they need to kind of come together as this found family. And that's what ends that section of episodes. And so the second half of the show being about, well, now that we've come together as a crew, what do we do to try to affect this kind of like larger change, and how do we push back against the innocent, not on this like small scale level, but on this kind of bigger level to create a change for our entire society? What is that? And I think that element is great. And I love the whole dynamic of this kind of very, you know, initially very kind of incompetent revolutionary force of Salt that has all these ideas about what the revolution needs to be, but doesn't have, you know, the resources or like the gumption or the know-how to actually do it and put it into action. And I think that kind of exploration of the revolution and this revolutionary force is great. And all of it centers on this character that is one of my favorite characters in the second half of the show, which is Katakam Zushim.
Yeah, Katakam Zushim rocks. His story is so good. He is voiced by Nakamura Hidetoshi, who you will also hear as Buran Blutark in Zeta Gundam, Tassilo Vaga in Victory Gundam, and Abel Bauer in Gundam X. I love saying these names. But no, it's a great performance. It's a great character. And I think what's so interesting about Katakam Zushim is that he comes in as like the ideal revolutionary leader. He's handsome, he's cool, he's able to get all these resources. Everybody loves him. He's doing like a really good job leading the crew, except for the fact that he has absolutely no idea about battle strategy or how to get things done. And as that is gradually revealed and Giron and the other people on the crew start to get disillusioned with him, there's such a good like tension in there. And then the actual resolution of his arc, where they finally get fed up with him, kick him out, he kind of raises a stink, but then in his final episode, he does kind of get to live up to some of his ideals, including, I think, one of the best story ideas and scenes in the entirety of Xabungle is his final scene, where he has survived. He does not actually died. And it is the best way this show plays with its no death rule, because he watches his own funeral, where the rest of the crew has finally come to respect him, and Plopopiev has even gone to this trouble of like staging a really cultured funeral for this man, and he gets to see all that, and he realizes that he's finally gotten what he wanted, so he just rides off into the sunset having had his perfect death. That is one of the best things that happens in Combat Mecha Xabungle.
Yes, that is the best thing in the second half of the show is his funeral and that whole episode. I mean, just with like Katacom, I think there's just this great character that they do a fantastic job of not having him fall into a cliche, which I think there are lots of like the cliches of the revolutionary leader that is ineffectual. That you could fall into, and he kind of like flirts around all of them, but he doesn't just become one of them, and so he feels like this very like complete, fully rounded character, where, you know, on the one hand, he is kind of like this like intellectual revolutionary, this guy who knows or thinks he knows what needs to happen. He kind of, you know, understands the nature of like the oppression that the civilians are suffering, and he thinks he has an idea of how to go about like fixing it, but when it comes to like actually walking the walk and not talking the talk, he doesn't really know how to do it, and he doesn't have the kind of the guts to really go through with it. And the thing he needs the iron gear for is that Jiron is this like ball of unbridled passion that like Jiron is the guy who can actually inspire people because he's the guy actually going out and doing it. And it's this kind of slow realization that Katacom needs to have that like it's one thing to sort of explain to people, this is what we need to do, and here's the practical way of going about the revolution, right? Because the big thing is like he is willing to kind of abandon people if he thinks that it's not like a practical strategy to go save them and all this kind of stuff, and he's willing to just kind of cut people off for the sake of his revolution. And he's not thinking about the fact that his role needs to be to inspire all these people to follow him for their own revolution and not just for them to praise this one figure. And he wants to be this charismatic, you know, man on the hill with waving the flag that everyone follows behind him, because that's the kind of this very self-centered dream he has. And it's really just the kind of very selfless, noble, bold action of someone like Jiron Amos, that's the kind of thing that people actually need to see, because that's the thing that will inspire themselves to take that kind of action. And so all the stuff of him being willing to sacrifice people in this kind of military strategic sense might make some kind of military strategic, you know, we need to conserve our resources, but it's never going to inspire people, because it leaves such a rotten taste in the mouth. And so Jiron's and the, you know, whole Iron Gears crew's attitude of we leave no man behind, we're, you know, no half measures, like we're always going to go for it. Like that is something that really inspires people. And so I love that his whole arc is that he's never a bad guy. You know, he's and it would just be easy to turn him into this like total and utter buffoon, and he never really falls all the way into that, and he kind of circles around it. And so that's what makes his funeral scene so fantastic, is that he does kind of get the thing that he wants. He does become the sort of revolutionary figure he's dreamed of. But the thing is that comes with him needing to functionally be a martyr. And so he hears all of that and slinks away. But the other part of it that you didn't say, Jonathan, is that there's this sort of like punchline to it, which is after everyone does their thing and Jiren's like crying at the funeral. It's like, Katakamu, it's like, you were a true man. You're a real man. And Katakamu slinks away. And then everyone gets him, is like, so is that what a funeral is supposed to be? It's like, yeah, well, that's what it says right here. This is what a cultured funeral is. It was like, okay, well, let's go on. Because, you know, nobody ever really cared all that much about Katakamu. But he got the thing that he thinks he wanted. And he does obviously do a big heroic thing. And he does get a big victory. But also, like, everyone needs to get on with their lives. And there's just, it's such a fascinating, weird scene. And at the time I was watching, it's like, God, please let this be his ending. And I was kind of like watching most of the rest of the show being like, please don't bring Katacom back, because they kept on bringing all these people back that I felt like should have been written off the show. And luckily he never does. And Katacom gets his whole proper resolution there and goes off into the sunset thinking he's gotten everything he wants. And the admiration of all these people is going to go live off his life somewhere else while everyone else actually does the revolution for him. It's a great, weird, very funny sequence that is the kind of thing that if Xabungle could have kept on doing things like that and went more in that direction with other character plot lines, I think it would have been like a great show rather than just the kind of like good show that it ends up being.
I completely agree, and I was just thinking about this, Sean, that this episode we're talking about is episode 41, and I think you could argue episode 41 is like the platonic ideal of Xabungle, because it is it has all the characteristics of Tomino's, filmmaking style and all that stuff, but then it takes these larger ideas and funnels it very effectively into this comedic structure, right? Where, like, those ideas, all the stuff you just laid out, Sean, like, those are real meaningful ideas, but they get to be explored in a way you wouldn't get in a Gundam show or in an Ideon, because we get to do it through the lens of comedy. And so you get this great, like, comedic irony of the final scene, where it is basically doing the structure of a tragedy. Like, in Gundam, Katakam would just be fucking dead, right? This would be a straight up tragedy. But you get to take the structure of a tragedy and do it through a comedy, and then it becomes really not just funny, but dynamic and interesting. And I think that's where Xabungle gets to do some of its best stuff. And I think ultimately the final episodes don't really choose one direction or the other and are more of a muddle.
Yeah, absolutely. But
Yeah.
Katakam stuff is, I just loved this character and what they did with him.
Yeah. You have another couple of characters from Salt who sort of come along for the ride, including Birin Nada, which was very confusing in my notes because you have Biram and Birin, who are both major characters in the second half of this show. I mentioned Birin because she is voiced by Majima Satomi, who was Miharu, the girl who has a very memorable death at the midpoint of Gundam 79. She's the one in Dublin who they pick up on the ship and then she gets thrown off. She is also Hirami in Zambot 3 and a computer in Daitarn 3. I don't know which computer, but she's a computer. Yeah. She did not work very long. She retired in 1985 because she married Furiatoru Amuro himself.
Yes. That's one of the many, like, marriages within the early Gundam family.
Yes, exactly. Birin, not like a huge, like, memorable character, but like, she's one of Katakam's, like, lieutenants who finally defects from him to the Iron Gear when she realizes how kind of useless he tends to be. So her arc is pretty good here. And then you do have two other characters who were technically in the first half of part 1, but we didn't talk about them much. And they are much bigger characters here. The first of those is Maria. She's another character who has the same first name and last name. She was in one big episode in the first half where she is sort of in the position of she's the pacifist who has to kind of learn to fight in that episode. And there she was voiced by Shimamoto Sumi, who is better known as Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. But then when she returns in the second half of the show as sort of a main character, she is voiced by Nomura Hiroko, who I could not find any major credits of. Her only other leading role was in 1982's Ai no Senshi Rainbow Man, which is a great name for a show. And then you also have, I can't believe we didn't talk about this last time, Sean, the best name in Combat Mecha Xabungle, Dr. Medic, who is a doctor, he is a medic, and his Christian name, is Dr. Medic. What a fucking name. It's great, and he is voiced by the wonderful Sato Masaharu, who you will probably recognize because he is the second generation voice of Kame Sennin in Dragon Ball. So he is the Turtle Hermit in Dragon Ball Kai, Dragon Ball Super, all of the recent movies, all of that stuff. So you can definitely hear that in his voice here. He's actually one of the biggest character actors in Dragon Ball because I found over 30 individual parts that he has played across the run of Dragon Ball, including he's the first person who ever did King Vegeta. He is one of the Rabbit Gang members in early Dragon Ball. He's one of the many one-off Shenlong voices we got. And of course, who can forget, he was Dr. Corey, the scientist who created Bio Broly in Dragon Ball Z Movie 11. So many, many wonderful parts. But as Dr. Medic, who is a really cool character, I love his role in the second half of this, where he kind of becomes Jiron's main sort of advisor because he's kind of the wise old man. But again, Tomino had a character who was a medic, and he named him Dr. Medic, and that is why Tomino is a fucking legend.
Yeah, I just want to see a scene where Dr. Medic, the doctor who is a medic, talks to Carrying Cargo, the guy whose job is to carry cargo from one place to another. I think they'll have a really great conversation about the nature of, look, sometimes you just have a certain destiny you have to fulfill. And if your name is Medic, you got to be a doctor. If your name is Carrying Cargo, well, here we go. It's like, I know what I'm fucking going to do when I grow up.
Yes, it is called nomenclatural predestination, Sean.
Exactly. Thank you. I love these two characters, Maria and Dr. Medic, which obviously go together because Maria is kind of like Dr. Medic's like sidekick or assistant or whatever. And I think both of them are just like really great injections of kind of fresh blood in the second half of the show, really like the last quarter of the show where they come in. And I do love that, you have this guy who, like, is a really minor presence right at the beginning of the show, but obviously was memorable enough that when he comes back, I was like, right, yeah, it's the guy, the doctor who they cheated out of in like the first episode of the show when Jiren had his broken arm. I think he popped up one other time in the first half of the show, and then he comes in, and I like how they kind of recontextualize him here as he reminds me of the Brad Dourif character in Deadwood, the doctor in Deadwood, as this kind of like gruff, doctor who's kind of seen it all and is willing to do whatever it takes, to heal the people around him. And he's, not going to take bullshit from no one. But
he's also got a heart of gold, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's got maybe a little bit better bedside manner than Brad Dourif's character in Deadwood did. But it's that kind of doctor character, or like Old West doctor character archetype that they're playing with, which I think is just great. And it is that thing where you do need someone, especially after you've had Katakam on the show for so long, who's someone who like knows what the fuck they're doing and has like, we talked about that history thing, has a relationship with like history and time in the past and has seen things in order to be that kind of guiding voice for the rest of the crew. Because I think you just like can't have Jiron Amos run a revolution on his own, because that boy doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. I love him and he's great and you need him because he's got all the energy and all the passion, but he doesn't know what to do with any of it. And Medic is just this guy who, like, in a very quiet way, just kind of like shapes the crew into like the direction that they need to go in order to be effective in the revolution. And obviously he becomes very central also in all like the Elchi stuff. And then you've got Maria, who I think is also a really fun character because, you start off thinking she's going to be your kind of cliche, kind of like pacifist character who's with the rest of the crew and is always like, poo-pooing the violence and stuff like that because she's trying to help people. But she ends up not being that. She ends up grabbing a fucking Uzi and just like going down. And I do like her like transformation from like a regular sort of nurse-like character to a revolutionary soldier who's with beating, like going and fucking hijacking the flying walker machines and stuff like that. And she's just like kicking ass. And I think that like slow evolution of the character from she was like, a farmer growing fucking vegetables to now she's just like, one of like their most stalwart fucking foot soldiers basically is a really cool character arc for her.
Totally. And it's like, it's generally in the background, but I came to like really appreciate all of her scenes, in part because the main characters of our show wind up being pretty static. You kind of become attuned to what's going on with our background characters. And Maria definitely has a really great arc where, she is like the most stalwart member of the resistance by the end. She will do whatever it fucking takes. And I love that. And it's very fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I did, Sean, break down all the episodes into arcs, kind of like we did last time. I don't really think we need to do it, though, and go through all of this, because I feel like we've talked about everything in the second half of the show. Are there other, like, plot beats or things going on here that you feel like we need to go through before we move on to the movie?
I think the main thing that we haven't talked about, because I think it's a really great section, is Blume and his stuff, where, you do have this great arc where... you have Elchi's been kidnapped, Jiren's, all about trying to save Elchi, and Blume's just kind of had enough with all this bullshit, because you also have this sort of like little tiny love story in the background of that he's always had this crush on Rag, and that obviously is not going to go anywhere. And he's, this is actually the thing that feels a little bit more like the Rekoa storyline from Zeta Gundam, but doesn't end up with him being a traitor, but just a sense of like, he's this guy on this crew who kind of slowly over the course of these episodes has kind of lost his place there, and Nobi's really appreciating him, and he just decides to like, fuck this shit, and he just leaves. And it's where you really feel the full benefit of having cast Furukawa Toshio as this character, because it's like that shift as you see Blume's dissatisfaction with everything that's going on, and the moment when you just can kind of feel in the character he's made the choice that he's going to leave and like kind of find his own way in the world, is so potent. I think that Furukawa Toshio just like his performance is just incredible. And there's so much kind of like emotion. You just feel so much for this guy. And I think even though there's not a lot of time committed to this character arc, like, cause he's not a central character. He's not Jiren, he's not Elchi, he's not Rag. He doesn't have a huge amount of screen time developing it, but you just feel everything that this guy is going through and why he feels like he has to make this choice. And I don't know about you, but I ended up fully siding with him and being like, yeah, dude, go. Like, these people aren't fucking appreciating you and giving you what you need. And it's like, you got to find what you need in the world. And obviously that leads to this whole arc with like BL and stuff like that. And I love, like, and Blue May gets his own little ship and his own crew. And I think that, and honestly, I wish the show, like, went even further with it and had him become, like, his own captain fully and not even, like, get reassimilated completely just into the Iron Gear, but become his own, like, kind of captain within the structure of Salt. Because I think that arc and seeing, like, how much potential this guy has that is not being fully used by everyone on the Iron Gear because they're not really seeing him is really well done. And I think like so much of it is carried by how much Furukawa Toshio's performance conveys the interiority of this guy.
Couldn't agree more. And I think of the batches of episodes, I identified 5 batches here, again, kind of in 4 or 5 episode sort of chunks. And I think of those, this section, which is episodes 32 to 36, is the best section of this stretch. Like, I just think that is a really tight set of episodes where you have Blue May desert and meet Beale, and I think all of that is really interesting for all the reasons you were just saying, Sean. This is also where you get the episode where Fat Man becomes kind of one of the main characters, and while it becomes too repetitive later on, I think the initial episode where he catches Elchi's like scent on the wind and he then runs off is a really fun episode, and I really love the focus on Fat Man because he's a cool character, and you have that, and then you have Jiron, who after seeing Blue May run away and Fat Man go after Elchi, Jiron kind of looks around at everyone obsessed with Katakam and goes, fuck this shit, and he goes off too, and then all 3 of them have basically deserted, and they reunite, and Jiron sees sort of how Blue May has now become a captain, and then this arc kind of culminates with them sneaking into Point H to go save Elchi, which is when they realize how brainwashed she's been, and that episode ends with this moment that feels like very propulsive to me, and I wish the show had like committed to building on this status quo change, where Blue May and Jiron are talking on their way back, and he reflects on the seriousness of the new status quo and how they're not going to just be able to win with being reckless anymore like they had been up to now, and Jiron agrees and says, yes, it's the end of an era, which is why I called this the end of an era arc, and I love that moment, and I wish it felt like there was a harder like demarcation point there, because as a build up to a shift in the story, that set of episodes works gangbusters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think there's just such a great sense of like his character and stuff for Blue May when you have the scene where Jiron ends up stumbling on him again, but it's Blue May's got his whole own crew and all this stuff with BL, and Jiron just assumes that Blue May has become a member of another crew, and the slow realization that he has, which I think the audience like gets very quickly, is like, no, dude, this is his fucking land ship. Like, this is his crew. And he's just not bragging about it or whatever, because he just kind of wants to, like, move on. And the slow, like, Jiron slowly putting together is like, oh, shit. like, this is your whole own fucking thing, man. I think is great. And again, I think kind of like with, it doesn't fully pull off that end of an era statement. It's another thing that it just kind of goes away, the fact that Blue May had his whole own ship and all that stuff, and I thought it was like a really cool reveal that he had put together his whole own situation, and that he doesn't need the members of the Iron Gear to be successful in life. Like, they were holding him back because he can do so much more.
Yeah. Absolutely. And like you saying the praises of his performance, but let's just pause for a second again to just think about what a fucking boon Furukawa Toshio is to every Tomino show. I mean, every anime he appears in, obviously, but also just like every Tomino show in particular. He is such a fucking like Swiss Army knife / secret weapon, because, we talked about in Zambot, like the best character in that show is his Shingo Kozuki, his character there, who like has this really, really awesome arc that he gets to play, and Furukawa is so good at it. Obviously, he is Kai Shiden in Gundam, who has one of the absolute best arcs there, and is just such a knockout of a character. And then he does it again here. It's like every time he and Tomino pair up, it's just fireworks, and it's just Furukawa is one of those actors who I think gets Tomino's dialogue, way of building characters, all of that stuff, and every time Tomino used him, Tomino had a great role ready for him to play, and it's always fun to see.
Yeah, and it's just, you could just feel he's so good in the show. And it's like you have a lot of other very good voice actors, including like some that are going to end up being like all-time great voice actors like Rag's voice actress. But it's Furukawa Toshio, it's Ginga Banjo as Temp Sharon,
So good.
and then and it's Shiozawa Kanato as Arthur Rank. Like those three, you can just feel like, oh my God, these guys are really fucking good at this. But obviously, they're the three biggest like kind of legends that happen to be in the show. But it's like, man, you can feel how fucking good they are. And everybody else is good, but they're just like on a different level.
Yes.
In terms of this stuff.
Well, with Ginga Banjo, remember, Timp is kind of his least important character in this half because he's also Fat Man and he gets to do more vocalizations here and he's great. But he's also the narrator who continues to be the most joyful, funny thing about this show. And I love the narrator's like growing anxiety over, is this show becoming too dramatic in the home stretch? Which I wish the show did become more dramatic, but I still enjoy the narrator being nervous about it. He's just so good at that. And I'm glad we're pausing to talk about Furukawa because this might be the last time we have an extended conversation about him in our Tomino-thon, because he is not in any of Tomino's future non-Gundam shows unless I'm missing one. And I think the next time we would see him is in his not cameo, but he's in a small arc of Zeta Gundam, where he's very good playing Kai Shiden as a cool-ass fucking journalist dude who's just kicks ass. But obviously he's not used in Gundam much in the future because he already is a Gundam character. Just again, every time he and Tomino paired up, it was great.
Although, of course, he does have one of the most legendary moments of Zeta Gundam where he has the letter or whatever, where it's he is a Char.
Yes, that man, he is a Char. Oh, man. I love this shit. All right. One other thing to mention from this batch of episodes is just the move up to, like, the snowy tundra region and all of that stuff. Especially in I would say the first like 10 episodes of this batch, Tomino has a fucking field day with the action. It's so good having all this stuff where the crew is having to relearn how to fight in the middle of the snow. You see all of these other, like when Timp comes back and he's got the pink mecha suits, the walker machines that have skis on them, and the way they're doing all of that, and then Jiron just like fucking rips those skis off and tries to learn how to use them himself. Like that's some of the best and most distinctive action in this show, and I really love how they make use of that change in location at the beginning of this stretch of episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the winter time like snow stuff looks great. There's that great sequence where Jiren's like going through the snow with this huge fucking chain and whipping it in front of him to try to find any mines that Timp's crew has left. There's just a lot of great, and again, it's kind of mostly centered in the early sections of this. But yeah, a lot of great action ideas and kind of plot ideas around how do they deal with the snow when we have been in the desert for so long. I do think it is hilarious that they just kind of all of a sudden are in the snow. Like there's no like kind of transition. It's just like, oh shit, yeah, and now it's just like fucking snowy mountains as far as the eye can see when you've been in like just absolute blasted desert land forever. But it's still great. And it's like it's a good shift in the overall aesthetic of the show, that you go into the snow.
It is like at least motivated by it happens when the innocent kidnap Elchi and then they basically fly her north. So they get there by pursuing Elchi. And so I do like that there's this kind of motivated, the shift in location comes with this major shift in the status quo of the story. And in this like new environment of the snow is also where they meet Salt. And again, like I think the early episodes of this stretch are so exciting and kind of all the new possibilities that are being thrown at us. And that is where sort of the disappointment of the final episodes comes in, where it feels flatter. And then I guess the last discussion to have here about the show itself is, I think we already hit most of the relevant points of the ending, and what works and what doesn't. I do have to say, the funniest thing in this entire show is that at the end we get Jiron is carrying Elchi, and then the whole crew comes in, and there's this very heartwarming moment with all of them. We get Hey You by Mio is hey playing you. Again, hey and you. It rocks. That insert song is great. But then after we get all the crew, we then get this procession of translucent versions of all the characters from the life of the show who start coming over. And the last one is Kashim King looks straight into the camera and waves, and that's the final shot of Combat Mecha Xabungle, is your big bad villain who blew himself up with an intercontinental ballistic missile and blinded our heroine, just smiles and waves goofily. I howled laughing at that, Sean. It is so fucking funny that is the way the show ends.
Yes, it definitely is like, it's the ultimate of the kind of fourth wall breaking gags of the show is that you do end with like, what is this kind of like a ghostly curtain call kind of thing. And yeah, you just don't see it coming because even though, yes, Costume King was one of the main characters, and yes, he did die, because most of the characters that you see in the silhouette are the people who have died, because it's all the people who aren't there running with them, which are just like who was ever in the status quo at the final section of the show. So it's everyone who's died, anyone who's kind of been left by the wayside up until then. And then, yes, you then have, you're like, oh, well, I guess, yeah, sure, Costume King, he's a character. But usually when you're watching a play and you have a big curtain call, you don't have, like, the villain be the final person. It's usually the hero. It's the last person that comes out that takes the final bow. But here it's the evil old fucking fascist dude, and it's pretty amazing.
I'm now imagining a version of Mobile Suit Gundam that ends with Giran Zabi coming out and just waving to everybody. Oh man, what a weird show, Sean.
It is an absolutely weird show, and we know it was a weird show because they made a weird fucking compilation movie of it. Even Toby was like, "This show's too weird. We can't just do a regular compilation movie. Let's make this thing fucking crazy."
All right, so released July 9th, 1983, about 6 months after the end of the show, and the same day as Aura Battler Dunbine episode 22, just to remember how compressed all of this is, we get Xabungle Grafitti in Japanese theaters. This is a compilation film of the series, but it is a very weird beast of a movie. It starts out like your typical compilation film, where it has the theme song, and then it has the beginning of the story in very compressed form, and then about 10 minutes into the movie, it feels like the movie gets bored of itself and stops taking its ADD meds. Because what happens is it starts leaping ahead and becomes a sort of quirky best of clip show. It uses the Eyecatch Breaks and front-end title cards, and then even starts inventing new Eyecatch Breaks and title cards and all of that stuff to break up clips from different parts of the show, many of which are just entirely out of context. The first jump it makes is from the initial theft of the Xabungle to the middle of the action in the Mud Sea with the Hanawan people, and then it goes back to an earlier part in the story. It doesn't really make any effort to introduce you to the characters or story. There's no possible way you could follow this without knowing the show. Like, this is not a Gundam movie, Ideon movie kind of situation where you could get by just watching the, and with Gundam you could have a very good time watching the movies. But there also isn't any kind of like framing device that structures the leaps arounds or give context to things other than some light added narration. There's also some fourth wall breaking moments. There's one early on where you first have Elchi come out in the Xabungle, and it shows the original, or what it says is the original key animation. That's not the original key animation. That's not what key animation looks like. It's just uncolored animation. But they say it's footage of the key animation so they can make a joke about, like, this is what happens when things aren't ready on time. They also like have some fourth wall breaks where they show you what all the parts of the Xabungle are. One of the funniest ones is that when they get to the episode with Toro and Milan, a character we didn't talk about, but she's a character in one episode who is introduced and dies in the same episode, but introduces Salt to us. They have a title card for the episode that is not the title card from that episode, but that introduces Toro and Milan, and it says, this is for those in the Kansai region, which is a reference to the fact that that episode didn't air in Kansai because of a high school baseball tournament the same day. Like, just an insane in-joke. In the second half of the movie, Chill starts coming out and reading like recaps and stuff, which is very cute. It's absolutely batshit. I took notes on like exactly how it breaks things up because it was just kind of breaking my brain a little bit. And it is, I don't think it's a good compilation movie, but it's a funny, weird, bizarre one. And I kind of enjoyed its off the walls energy.
Yeah, I kind of have two feelings about it. Like, one, I do think all like the madness of it is kind of inspired in a weird way of all this like the random fucking fourth wall break in jokes. I mean, there's like because there's those are some of like the big ones, but there's a bunch of weird small ones all over the place. Like, I think probably my favorite is there's just a point where they're cut to Chill, and Chill's just singing the fucking Aura Battler Dunbine opening. Like, you see, she sings just like one line from it. But because I've started watching Aura Battler Dunbine already, and then also I heard that theme song about 1,000 billion times playing Super Robot Wars Y, because it plays every time you attack with one of the Or Battler Dunbine characters, which are very good, and so I use them a lot. It was just like, it triggered something in my brain of like, oh my god, what is happening? But I mean, she sings the line where they talk about the Aura Road in the opening of Or Battler Dunbine. There's just a bunch of shit like that. That stuff's very funny. But when you're actually just watching the clips of the show, especially when, I had just watched the show, I did find myself sort of zoning out, and I did sort of half-watch parts of this movie while also playing Super Robot Wars Alpha on my PlayStation, hacked PlayStation Vita, because it is definitely like, you just can't watch it as a movie. It's not like, the Ideona Contact, which is like maybe, a little bit overly dry. You're certainly not getting the full experience of the story from the TV show. But you could watch that as a movie and come away having seen a story. You can't really watch this way. It's much more... Honestly, it's not even really a recap episode from an anime. It feels like a recap episode from an American sitcom that's one of your best of clip shows. And that's
what it feels like to me is it's like one of the Simpsons clip shows, where when the Simpsons would do clip shows in the 90s, clip shows were already a pretty staid thing, and they just made fun of the clip show format whenever they did clip shows because they were very bitter about having to do it. And so the Simpsons clip shows are actually very fun to watch. The thing, though, that The Simpsons can do that allows them to get away with it is they're 20 minutes long. This is 80 minutes, and I think a shorter version of this with this energy would be pretty great. I think at 84 minutes, it's in kind of a no man's land where it can't be a substantive compilation movie, but it is also too long for the gag to really work. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that's what it is. That if it was just like a 20-minute thing, that the size of a regular episode, I think it could be like fun and entertaining. But yes, it's just like a certain point where you're like, oh my god, I can't. I would have had to split it up into multiple viewing sessions, or have my PS Vita at my side and be like, well, I can also fight the Zentradi in space with my characters in Super Robot Wars Alpha.
I will say, always keeping in mind what these movies were actually made for. Yes. I think if you were a fan of this show who watched it on Japanese television, and then, 6 months later it was in theaters, and you got to maybe take some friends and go just have a fun 90 minutes laughing with this show you loved, I think it would be very fun in that original theatrical context. I think it would work really well there, and I could imagine people having fond memories of it for that reason. Again, we just live in an era where this kind of thing isn't necessary anymore because we can pirate the episodes or go buy the Blu-ray or whatever. And obviously for children, for anybody watching this in the 1980s, that was not in any way an option.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't have any problem with it existing, but yeah, it is, and I'm happy. So I have the like it's not like a nice Blu-ray or anything. It's just a standard definition version of the show. But the Blu-ray that does exist, that was released over here, and I appreciated that they included it on there.
Yeah,
because it's not like if you watch Combat Mecha Xabungle, you gotta also watch Xabungle Grafitti. It's certainly not like Ideona Be Invoked. It isn't even like Ideona Contact, which you don't need to watch the first Ideona movie. If you watch the TV show, you can skip it, like I originally did. But you could watch it and it's fine. This is like, unless you're a completionist, or maybe it's like you watched the show a while ago and you're like, I like that show. I want to touch it again. Like, I just want to feel a little bit of that Combat Mecha Xabungle. Then you could put this on and watch a bit of it and then probably end up turning it off. But yeah, it is definitely not, in the modern context, it's not something you need to go out and watch.
But if you stick around to the end, you do get a revised ending that you could actually cut pretty easily into the episode if you wanted to make your own revised ending of the TV show. Because what we get here is, after Timp runs away, we get another new Eyecatch scene, which is with all the characters leaping into frame, and then we move into the ending. It's the same until Jiron starts running back with Elchi. Then we get a new insert song. This movie has 2 new songs from Mio. Clearly, they just went fucking mad for Mio. She had 2 songs for the show. She did another 2 for the movie. She's doing the theme to Dunbine. She's just everywhere at this point, and for good reason, because these songs rock. And so we get the sadder, ballad style insert song here. You get all the stuff with Fat Man coming back and snatching Elchi, rag kissing Jiren, and all of that. Then you get some new animation because a plane flies in with Arthur Rank, who is miraculously revived. He comes back with the same flowery border around the screen as when he was first introduced. And to be clear, Xabungle Grafitti does show his death exactly the way it happens in the show, which is fairly unambiguous. But he is back. He tells them, I really wanted to see what would happen with you civilians, so I put on an awful act, implying that I guess it was all scripted and he wasn't really sick and didn't die. He offers to heal Elchi's vision using innocent technology, and then he flies off with her, and we get another new song, our final insert song, as everybody fights for space in the center of the frame, and the words "Just Run" appear in big red letters as the final credits play out alongside clips from across the series. Tomino says he made this change to the ending based on his original intention of a work where no one dies, and said that, quote, "The death of Arthur and Elchi's blindness in the TV version left a bad taste that stuck in my mind in contrast to the overall mood of the work. So instead we get this, which I will say, if nothing else, is endearingly goofy, and I did enjoy watching it."
Yeah, it was very funny because I knew that Arthur doesn't die in the movie because I had read that in one of the museum book specifically mentioned that somewhere. I was like, oh, okay. And I didn't even, at the point I read that, I didn't even know who Arthur was. I was like, okay, I guess there's some dude who's named Arthur who doesn't die. And then by the time I finished the show, I'm like, oh, okay, so that, I guess in the movie, that's what they're going to change. And so I'm watching the movie, and I'm like, kind of like, because you're almost at the end by the time all this shit's happening. And I was like, sort of half watching it, half not at that point. And I'm like, they're almost at the point where in the show where Arthur dies. I really need to pay attention to this part because something's going to be different. And then the whole sequence plays out 100% identically. Like, huh. And at that point, I was like, maybe I misunderstood what I had read, and I was wrong. I was thinking about something else. And then no, they do just sort of tack on some animation at the very, very end of the TV show ending where he flies in, and it's very funny. Like it's way funnier watching it knowing that the ending is supposed to be that he's not dead than just watching it regularly because it pulls like a fast one on you. It feels like where you're like, oh fuck, I guess no, he is dead. Oh no, here he is. And yes, there is something incredibly cruel about the idea that he somehow faked his own death as one last way of testing to see if these were truly the people ready to inherit the earth. It's like, man, that's fucked up. I probably, if I was Elchi, I probably would not be super into Arthur Rank after he said he did that shit.
It's kind of funny, trying to compare this to the original ending. There's a part of me that does genuinely prefer this ending because it feels truer to the weird thing the show was doing in the end, where I think a big problem with Xabungle down the home stretch is its use of tone, in that it can't decide if the presence of comedy, which to be clear is not a problem. You could have a more serious version of the story and still have lots of fun, goofy comedy. I don't think those things have to conflict. But I think the show itself is unclear if the presence of comedy means they can't have serious consequences. And so you start getting stuff like Arthur dies, but then a lot of silly stuff happens along the side, or Fat Man makes his big final sacrifice, but then he's there anyway. And so that kind of cuts, and I think that in particular cuts against what they're doing with Elchi, where Elchi's blindness should be this thing that kind of drives home the main theme of the show, which is about people coming together to live and help one another. But it's hard to buy the stakes of Elchi's blindness when Fat Man survived the same blast that took her vision. So there's something about having Arthur just fly in and go, a wizard did it, I can fix your eyes, that kind of feels truer to what the show was doing. Does that make sense?
No, I mean, yeah, I'm making, poking fun at the way the movie does it with just playing his death scene exactly the same. But I do think this is a better version of the ending. If this is what the show is going to be, and this is what the whole climax of the show is going to be like, if you're going to end the TV show with a ghostly figure of Cashem King waving and winking into the camera, yes, you should also have Arthur Rank appear from nowhere out of a magic airplane he got somehow after he exploded, and also was deathly ill and was going to die anyways, which is the whole reason why he did it, is because he was going to die. So he's like, well, if I'm going to die, I might as well die for something. You might as well come and fly on an airplane and then magically cure her blindness. I definitely think that this version of the ending feels like it commits to what the ending was trying to be, in a show that was very non-committal in its home stretch. Because I am with you that the thing that causes the final section of the show to not really work is that it doesn't pick its tone. Is that it does both we have a comically massive missile. Well, it does both the like Arthur's going to blow up. We're going to have like that one fleet of their like other allies and the Salt people get exploded by basically a nuclear bomb, and you know, Jiron scream out to the heavens about like the injustice of all of this, and then like in questions like, is this what these people are capable? Is this the kind of destruction that we're facing against? And then immediately turn around and have the next episode them shoot a giant missile at the Iron Gear that's like a big cartoon missile that Jiren just grabs and then throws at Kid Horla's ship, blows up Kid Horla's ship, but Kid Horla is fine except for it burned the butt out of his pants, and so there's a butt joke. Like, it's just those two things are very hard to take in contrast with each other, because it's kind of like what you're saying with like the explosion, like not actually killing Fat Man, but also taking Elchi's blindness. It's like, are these missiles an object of comedy or are they an object of drama? Because it's like, it kind of feels like you need to pick one or the other. And I don't actually care which one you pick, but like you need to commit to it, and the show just doesn't commit. So if you're going to be in this weird tonal space where nothing matters, that it's all fucking insane, you might as well go all the way at the very end and have Arthur come in on his airplane and have your last little joke with that.
Yeah, to be clear, I don't think either of these are the right ending for Combat Mecha Xabungle, but of the two endings we have, I prefer Magical Wizard Arthur Rank coming in and curing Elchi's vision. Why not?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anything else to say about Combat Mecha Xabungle before we move on to the next phase of our TOMINO-THON?
This is the fucking wild show, man. Like,
yes, it is.
Like, yeah, it was like, it's just, it's so crazy. And again, I do want to like, you know, take that step back and appreciate just like how revolutionary this show was. A lot of we talked about on last week's episode, but just the whole structure of it, the like we have, you know, the way that it uses the mechs, the walkers, the way that it has the replacement new version of the main character's mecha at the midpoint of the show, like the use of the insert songs, all this stuff, and then our Elchi character arc, and that whole character archetype that it brings in. Like, for such an insane, weird show that, again, Tomino came up with at 2 a.m. in his fucking hotel room or whatever, after he did some fucking stretches and took a bath because he was freaking the fuck out. It's just crazy that this is the show it ends up being. And I kind of, even though it ended up being a much more kind of mixed show by the end, I can't help but love it. I think I'll always love Xabungle. And it made me very desperately, in my current Super Robot Wars fucking obsession I'm in, to find one of the Super Robot Wars games that Xabungle's in. There's only a couple, but I want to see these characters in something else because I love this fucking crew of idiots, and I want to see more of them.
I agree with all of that, and I was thinking, like, this show would lend itself well to a Fire Emblem-style tactics game so perfectly because of the idea of you have this main ship, and you have your crew, but you're moving along the ground through the whole thing. They gradually get, you know, new weapons and whatnot, but then also the idea that in the second half it becomes a whole fleet. Like, I think you could make a really killer, like, tactical RPG out of Combat Mecha Xabungle that I would love to play. Yeah,
absolutely. That's basically what Super Robot Wars is. So
there you go.
There turns out they made a lot of those kinds of games. So if you want to play them, just ask me. I have some advice.
Next season on Japanimation Station, we just stop doing anime and start doing video games and play all the Super Robot Wars.
And we will do that until we are dead because there's like 100 of those games. Yes, but I think that wraps it up for Combat Mecha Xabungle. But we are far from done with our TOMINO-THON, Jonathan, because next week we're stepping out of the post-apocalyptic Western world and we're stepping into the world of fantasy, which is not, I think, where if you're just someone who watches Gundam, you think Tomino would go, but it turns out it was kind of a big thing for Tomino. So we get some fucking swords, we get some fucking fairies, we get mechs that run on magic. It is a wild and very different world. We'll be starting next time on our TOMINO-THON with Aura Battler Dunbine.
「 しいほど美しい時代ない